There is a question that scientists, geneticists, historians, and anthropologists have been circling for over a century, and nobody has given a clean answer. Not a satisfying one. Not one that accounts for everything. The question sounds simple when you say it out loud. Why do the British look the way they do, not as individuals, as a population? Because if you have ever stood in a crowd in central London and then travelled, really travelled, to continental Europe, to Paris, to Berlin, to Rome, to Warsaw, you start to notice something you cannot quite put into words. Something slightly off in a way that is not about culture or fashion or language. Something deeper, something written into faces and bone structure and colouring in a way that feels ancient. And when you start pulling on that thread, when you start asking the real questions, not the polite ones, not the ones that get sanitized by textbooks, you find yourself tumbling down into deep time, into ice ages, into forgotten migrations, into genetics that contradict the official story, into bloodlines that survive catastrophes that should have wiped everyone out, into mysteries about a small archipelago off the northwestern edge of Europe that absorbed wave after wave of invasion, absorbed every conquering force that ever landed on its shores, and somehow, impossibly, kept something ancient alive underneath all of it. This is that story, and it is stranger than you have been told. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Before we go anywhere, we need to establish something that most people get wrong. The British Isles are not simply a western extension of Europe. They look like it on a map. They sit just across a narrow channel from France. But genetically, archaeologically, and in ways that even modern science is still trying to fully decode, Britain has always been something slightly different, something separate, something that keeps surprising the researchers who study it. And the reason for that starts not with Romans or Vikings or Normans, not with any of the famous invasions you learned about in school. The reason starts roughly 14,000 years ago, when the last ice age was finally losing its grip on the northern hemisphere, and a warming planet was transforming an Arctic wasteland into something livable for the first time in tens of thousands of years. Picture what Britain looked like 14,000 years before the present. There is no Britain. Not really. Not yet. The land that will eventually become England, Scotland, and Wales is still connected to continental Europe by a vast, flat, boggy landmass that geologists now call Doggerland. It stretches hundreds of kilometres out from what will become the coast of Norfolk and Suffolk and Lincolnshire, all the way across to what is now Denmark and the Netherlands. It is not ocean, it is land, tundra shading into boreal forest as temperatures climb. And across that land, the first humans are moving in. Not armies, not organised migrations, just small bands of hunters following the herds of reindeer and wild horse and woolly rhinoceros as the ice retreats northward. These are the people who will eventually become, after a chain of events so long and complicated, it reads like myth, the population of Britain. Except here is what nobody puts in the school syllabus. Those first post-glacial settlers of Britain were not white, not in any modern understanding of that word. The genetic analysis that has emerged from ancient DNA research over the past 15 years has overturned a picture that anthropologists spent generations assuming was settled. The first hunter-gatherers who moved into Britain as the ice retreated had dark skin. They had dark or black hair. And they had, and this is the detail that genuinely stops people cold when they first encounter it, blue eyes, dark skin and blue eyes. A combination that feels almost impossible to modern intuitions trained on current European populations, but which the genetics make absolutely clear. The most famous example of this early British population is a skeleton discovered in a cave in the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset in 1903. The remains sat in a museum for nearly a century before DNA extraction techniques became sophisticated enough to read what was written in those ancient bones. And when researchers finally sequenced the genome of the individual, now known as Cheddar Man, who lived approximately 10,000 years ago, the results caused a genuine scientific controversy. He had the genetic variants associated with dark pigmentation. He almost certainly had blue or green eyes. He belonged to a population that had migrated into Britain from the Middle East via the Balkans thousands of years earlier, hunter-gatherers who carried with them a completely different physical appearance from what we associate with Britain today. So where did the pale skin come from? Where did the red hair come from? Where did all the variation, the freckles, the particular bone structure, the tendency towards certain eye shapes, the colouring that still marks British people as subtly distinct, even from their closest French or German neighbours, where did any of that originate? The answer is layered, and each layer, when you examine it closely, contains a mystery of its own. The first layer is agricultural. Around 6,000 years ago, roughly 4,000 BC, a new wave of people began arriving in Britain. They came from the continent, specifically from communities that had adopted farming and animal husbandry in what is now France and Germany. These were the Neolithic farmers, and they transformed Britain in ways we are still discovering. They cleared the ancient forests. They built the first permanent settlements. They constructed the megalithic monuments, the long barrows, the passage tombs, the cursus monuments that still stud the British landscape. And they were physically different from the hunter-gatherers they encountered and eventually displaced. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain were shorter. They had olive-toned skin. They were descended from Anatolian agricultural communities that had spread westward from modern Turkey, and they look, in genetic terms, most similar to populations in modern Sardinia, populations that were isolated enough to preserve a kind of genetic snapshot of what those first European farmers looked like before later migrations diluted the signal. The hunter-gatherers and the farmers coexisted for a while. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that the two populations lived side by side in some regions for generations. But the farmers had a structural advantage. They could support more people per square kilometre of land. Population density favours one group over another when resources grow tight. Within roughly 1,000 years of the farmers' arrival, the ancient hunter-gatherer genetic signal had declined to near zero in most of Britain. Cheddarman's people were essentially gone as a distinct population absorbed, displaced, or simply outnumbered into genetic invisibility. Britain was now, very broadly speaking, a land of Neolithic farmers. It had megalithic monuments and domesticated cattle, and a completely different relationship to the land than anything the hunters had practiced. And then came the transformation that researchers only began to fully understand in the last decade, the arrival that changed everything. That made Britain genetically the place it is today more than any Roman legion or Viking longship ever did. Around 2400 BC, something happened in Britain that archaeologists spent most of the 20th century struggling to explain. The Neolithic culture that had dominated for 2,000 years essentially vanishes. The pottery styles change completely. The burial practices change. The architecture of the period shifts. And when geneticists began examining the ancient DNA from this transition, they found something so dramatic it upended conventional archaeological thinking about what had been assumed to be a simple cultural diffusion. This was not cultural influence spreading from the continent. This was a population replacement. Somewhere between 2,400 and 2000 BC, a group called the Bell Beaker people, named for a distinctive style of inverted bell-shaped drinking vessel found across a huge swathe of Europe, arrived in Britain and replaced up to 90% of the existing population within a few generations. 90%. In genetic terms, the Britain of 2500 BC and the Britain of 2000 BC are almost completely different populations. The people buried in the megalithic monuments were essentially gone, replaced by newcomers who carried a different genetic ancestry, different burial customs, and critically a different physical template. The Bell Beaker people who flooded into Britain during the early Bronze Age were descended from populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, in what is now Ukraine and Russia. These steppe people, sometimes called the Yamnaya, named for a particular archaeological culture, had already swept across continental Europe in the preceding centuries, massively transforming the genetics of populations from the Baltic coast to the Iberian Peninsula. They brought with them horses, wheeled vehicles, Proto-Indo-European languages that would eventually become most of the languages of modern Europe, and a distinctive genetic signature that included higher frequencies of the variants associated with lighter skin, lighter hair, and lighter eyes. They were the vanguard of a transformation that would eventually produce the general appearance of modern northwestern Europeans. And when they arrived in Britain, they arrived in overwhelming numbers. Whatever conflict, whatever process, Whatever dynamic played out between the incoming bell-beaker migrants and the existing Neolithic farming population, the genetic result was almost total replacement. Britain was, yet again, a different population. But here is where the specifically British story diverges from the continental European story. And this is the crux of what makes the British population genetically unusual in ways that researchers are still working to explain fully. After the bell-beaker replacement, Britain was to a first approximation similar in genetic terms to northwestern continental Europe. Similar, but not identical. And in the thousands of years that followed, the two trajectories diverged. Continental Europe kept experiencing waves of migration, population movement, admixture, and genetic reshuffling that Britain, protected by the English Channel, experienced only partially and irregularly. The Channel is not very wide. On a clear day, you can see France from the white cliffs of Dover. But it was wide enough, historically, to be a meaningful barrier, not impassable, but difficult. And that difficulty meant that while European populations continued to mix and move and blend over the millennia, Britain's genetic pool became something subtly, persistently different. The Romans arrived in 43 AD and governed Britain for nearly 4 centuries. 400 years is a long time. Long enough, you would think, to leave a massive genetic imprint. But they didn't. Roman Britain was real. Roman culture transformed the island. Roman roads, Roman cities, Roman baths, Roman religion, all of it left physical marks on the landscape that survived the empire itself. But Roman genes? Remarkably absent. Ancient DNA studies of Roman-era Britain show that the majority of the population in most regions remained essentially the same as the pre-Roman Bronze Age population. The soldiers and administrators who garrisoned Britain came from across the empire. There are tombstones in York from men whose origins genetic analysis has placed in North Africa and the Middle East, but these individuals did not leave a lasting genetic legacy on the general British population. They were a layer of paint over a wall built long before they arrived. The Anglo-Saxons are a different story. After Rome withdrew its legions in the early 5th century AD, groups from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, began raiding and then settling the eastern coast of Britain. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists debated whether this Anglo-Saxon arrival was primarily a cultural takeover, existing British populations simply adopting the language and customs of newcomers, or whether it involved significant population movement. The genetic evidence has now settled that debate, and the answer sits somewhere between the two poles, but leans toward actual migration more than the cultural diffusion camp was comfortable admitting. In eastern England, especially the regions that became the Anglo-Saxon heartland, the genetic contribution of the incoming Germanic migrants was substantial. Modern populations in eastern England carry significantly more of the genetic ancestry associated with ancient German and Scandinavian populations than do populations in Wales or Western Scotland. The Anglo-Saxon migration was real, and it left real genetic traces. And then the Vikings. 200 years of Norse raiding and settlement, beginning in the late 8th century and continuing through the 9th and 10th, overlapping in some regions with the Anglo-Saxon settlement that preceded them. The Norse came from what is now Norway and Denmark. Genetically, they were not dramatically different from the Anglo-Saxons who had arrived centuries before. But they settled in distinct regions, the Northern Isles of Scotland, the north and east of England, Dublin and Eastern Ireland, parts of northern France that would later contribute to the Norman invasion. The place names they left behind are so thick across certain parts of England that you can trace their settlements by the by and thorpe and wick suffixes scattered across the maps of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And their genes are still detectable, still slightly elevating the northern European contribution in the regions where they concentrated. And then, the Normans. 1066, the conquest that everyone learns in school. William the Conqueror crossing from Normandy and defeating Harold at Hastings and transforming the English language and aristocracy. But the Normans were, genetically, mostly descendants of the same Scandinavian stock as the Vikings who had settled Normandy a century and a half earlier. Their genetic contribution to the British population was real but limited. They were a ruling class, not a mass migration. The DNA studies suggest that the Norman conquest left a clearer cultural imprint than a genetic one. So you take all of that, the ancient hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers, the Bell Beaker steppe people, the Iron Age Celts, the Romans who barely left a trace, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans. You layer all of those on top of each other, and you get the genetic makeup of modern Britain. But that layering does not explain everything, because when geneticists compare modern British populations to their closest continental relatives, they find persistent, consistent differences that suggest Britain's isolation was doing something more subtle than just limiting the number of new arrivals. It was preserving something old, something that had been shuffled out of most continental European populations by millennia of movement and admixture, but had survived in the protected corners of a rainy island at the edge of the world. Specifically, British populations, particularly in Wales, Scotland, and the west of England, carry unusually high levels of ancestry that traces back to the ancient populations of Western Europe who survived the last ice age in refugia along the Atlantic coast. These were people who sheltered in the warmer southwestern corners of the continent during the glacial maximum and then spread back northward as the ice retreated. Their genetic signature is sometimes called Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, and it survived in Britain at higher levels than in most of continental Europe, because Britain's geography limited the subsequent waves of migration from the east that diluted this ancient ancestry elsewhere. The Welsh, in particular, carry a genetic profile that in some respects looks more like the ancient pre-agricultural Europeans than perhaps any other population in northwestern Europe. They are, in a very real genomic sense, the descendants of some of the oldest populations that ever inhabited this part of the world. That is not mythology, that is not nationalism. That is what the ancient DNA says. And the red hair, the famous British red hair, the trait that outsiders notice immediately and that has no parallel at the same frequency in any other large population on Earth. Where does it come from? The genetic variant most strongly associated with red hair, a variant in a gene called MC1R, appears to have been present in Britain and Ireland at high frequency for a very long time. Some researchers have suggested it may have been carried by those ancient Atlantic coast populations, the ones who sheltered from the Ice Age and then repopulated the western fringe of Europe. The frequency of red hair is highest in Scotland and Ireland, precisely the regions that received the least subsequent admixture from eastern populations. This is probably not a coincidence. The red hair may be a signal, one of the most visible, most instantly recognizable signals of deep ancestry that traces back not to the Celts, not to the Anglo-Saxons, not to any named historical group, but to people who lived on this island and its neighboring coasts during an era so old that there was no Britain, no Europe as a concept, nothing but hunters following herds across a cold and changing landscape. This is the first layer of the answer to the question we started with. Why do the British look different? Because they are different, not completely, not absolutely, but meaningfully, statistically, in ways that reflect a genuinely unusual history. A history of geographic isolation that preserved ancient genetic contributions that were erased elsewhere. A history of successive population movements that layered distinctly, leaving each wave detectable in the modern genome rather than homogenized into a continental average. And a history that goes back far further than most people realize, to Ice Age refugia and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and a landscape that was physically part of Europe and then was cut off, slowly, as the seas rose and Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea around 6,000 years ago, sealing Britain into a kind of genetic semi-isolation that would define its population history for the next 6 millennia. But the genetics are only the beginning, because genetics explain what happened without fully explaining why it produced what it produced. To understand that, to understand why the British look not just genetically distinct but visually, facially, in terms of colouring and bone structure and the particular way, certain features cluster in certain ways in certain regions, you need to understand what island isolation does to a population over thousands of years. And that takes us somewhere most popular histories of Britain refuse to go, into the deep genetics of selection. Into the question of what this island's specific climate and diet and disease environment was doing to the people who lived on it, generation after generation, shaping faces and bodies through pressures that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with survival. Britain is a cold island, you probably already knew that. But the specific quality of that cold, the particular character of the damp and the overcast, and the specific spectrum of light that reaches the ground through clouds that park themselves over the British Isles for months at a time, That specific environment has been doing something to human biology on this island for 10,000 years. And what it has been doing is, in a very literal sense, building British faces. Start with vitamin D. The human body produces vitamin D in the skin when ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight hits a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol and converts it. This process is efficient in strong sunlight. It is extremely inefficient in the grey, filtered, cloud-diffused light that characterises Britain for the majority of the year. In Britain, between October and March, the angle of the sun is so low that even on a clear day, the UVB radiation reaching the surface is insufficient to trigger meaningful vitamin D synthesis in the skin, regardless of skin tone. Darker skin with more melanin requires more UVB to produce the same amount of vitamin D as lighter skin. In a sunny environment, this is not a problem. In sub-Saharan Africa, where vitamin D is essentially never the limiting factor, dark skin is protective against the harmful effects of UVA radiation without costing anything in terms of vitamin D production. But in Britain, in Northern Europe generally, in any environment where sunlight is scarce and weak for half the year, dark skin becomes a genuine survival disadvantage. Individuals with lighter skin that can extract vitamin D from the weaker, less frequent sunlight available in northern latitudes, survive and reproduce better than individuals with darker skin in the same environment, because vitamin D is not optional. It regulates calcium absorption and bone density. Vitamin D deficiency causes rickets in children, a disease that deforms the pelvis in ways that make childbirth extremely dangerous. It compromises immune function. It is linked to a dozen serious health conditions. In a pre-modern population living in Britain, vitamin D deficiency was a genuine killer, and skin color is the body's primary mechanism for managing vitamin D production. This is the standard evolutionary explanation for light skin in Northern Europeans, and it is almost certainly correct as far as it goes. The genetic variants associated with lighter skin in Europeans are not all the same. There are several different mutations in several different genes, and they appear to have been selected at different times and spread at different rates. Fascinatingly, the ancient DNA evidence suggests that the skin-lightening mutations did not reach high frequency in European populations until surprisingly recently in some cases, not until the Neolithic period or even later. The original hunter-gatherers who colonized post-glacial Europe, including those who first settled Britain, appear to have been darker-skinned than the European farmers who came after them. Even though those hunter-gatherers had been living in high-latitude, low-sunlight environments for thousands of years, this is a puzzle that researchers are still working to solve. One hypothesis is that the hunter-gatherer diet, rich in fatty fish, animal liver, and other natural sources of vitamin D, partially compensated for low UV exposure, reducing the selection pressure for lighter skin. When farming arrived, and the diet shifted toward grains and domesticated animals that provided less dietary vitamin D, the selection pressure for lighter skin suddenly became more intense, and skin lightening spread rapidly through the agricultural population within a relatively small number of generations. Whatever the exact timeline, the result is clear. Britain's specific light environment selected, over thousands of years, for the particular pale skin tone that now characterizes much of the British population. Not because of any singular ancestral group, not because the Celts or the Saxons or any named people were inherently pale, but because the island's geography, its latitude, its cloudiness, its specific light budget was doing something to every population that settled there, generation after generation, favoring the individuals who could make enough vitamin D in grey weather to survive and reproduce. But skin color is only one piece of the visual puzzle. Hair color is another. And the specific pattern of hair color, in Britain the higher frequency of red and auburn tones, the higher frequency of very dark near-black hair alongside very light blonde, the particular range of browns that characterizes British hair in a way that feels different from the more homogeneous distribution you see in, say, central Germany or France, that pattern reflects a different set of genetic histories. Red hair, as noted earlier, appears to be associated with ancient Atlantic coast ancestry. The MC1R variants responsible for it have been found in ancient DNA from Atlantic European populations, going back thousands of years. But red hair interacts with other genetic factors in ways that produce the wide range of pigmentation Britain is known for. The same MC1R variants that produce vivid red in one genetic background produce auburn or strawberry blonde, or simply an increased tendency to burn in sunlight in other backgrounds. The diversity of British hair colouring, which genuinely is unusual compared to most European populations, reflects the overlapping, non-fully merged genetic histories we discussed earlier. Multiple founding populations, each with their own pigmentation genetics, mixing but not completely homogenizing, producing a wider range of outcomes than any single founding population would generate. Eye color works similarly. Britain has unusually high frequencies of blue and green eyes compared to most European populations, and within those categories, a particularly high frequency of the variant eye colors that sit in between the major categories, the hazel and grey-green and amber-flecked browns, that are difficult to classify but instantly recognizable as British when you see them in aggregate. This pattern also appears to reflect the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that Britain preserved, while much of continental Europe diluted it through subsequent migrations from populations with higher frequencies of brown eyes. Blue eyes appear to trace back to a single common ancestor who lived somewhere around the Black Sea region between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a mutation that spread rapidly through the population, likely through some combination of sexual selection and possible association with the lighter skin variants that were themselves under strong positive selection. The frequencies of blue and green eyes in Britain today, particularly in Scotland and Ireland and Wales, may be one of the most visible markers of the ancient genetic contributions that Britain's geography preserved. And then there is bone structure, faces. The thing that is hardest to quantify but most immediately perceptible when you look at aggregated British faces and compare them to aggregated faces from continental European populations of similar genetic broadly northwestern European ancestry. There is something there. Researchers studying cranial morphology have consistently found that British populations show a combination of features that is measurably distinct from close continental neighbours: longer skulls on average, narrower facial width in some regional populations, the particular configuration of brow ridge and jaw and nose shape that varies by region within Britain, the faces of people from Cornwall looking subtly different from faces from Yorkshire, both looking subtly different from faces from the Scottish Highlands in ways that track the different proportions of the underlying founding populations in each region. This is not pseudoscience. Physical anthropologists have been measuring and documenting these regional variations for over a century, and the more recent genetic data broadly confirms what the older morphological measurements suggested. Britain is not a single genetic population. It is a patchwork of regional populations, each with slightly different proportions of the various ancestral contributions, each therefore showing slightly different aggregate physical characteristics. The people of Cornwall and Devon carry unusually high levels of ancient British ancestry that may trace back to the pre-Roman Iron Age population. The people of central and eastern England carry higher proportions of Anglo-Saxon ancestry than any other region. The people of Orkney and Shetland are genetically closer to modern Norwegian populations than they are to people from southern England. Wales preserves the highest frequencies of ancient pre-Bronze Age ancestry of any region in Britain. These are not slight differences. They are substantial, documented, reproducible differences in genome-wide ancestry proportions, and they produce exactly the kind of subtle but perceptible regional facial variation that anyone who has spent time travelling around Britain instinctively notices without necessarily being able to articulate why. The island geography enforced this regional patchwork in ways that continental geography could not. In continental Europe, populations could mix freely across the Great Plains of northern France and Germany and Poland without natural barriers to slow them down. In Britain, the terrain itself fragmented populations. The Welsh mountains preserved the Welsh from large-scale Anglo-Saxon penetration for centuries. The Scottish Highlands were difficult enough to penetrate that the original Celtic-speaking population maintained demographic dominance well into the modern era. Cornwall was a peninsula at the extreme southwestern end of the island and reached last by eastern migrants and always somewhat separate. These geographic refugia allowed ancient genetic patterns to survive in Britain long after they had been erased from most of continental Europe by simple demographic diffusion. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Because when researchers compare the ancient genetic ancestry preserved in the most isolated British populations to other populations around the world with similarly unusual genetic preservation, they find connections that nobody expected. The ancient Western European ancestry that clusters at high frequency in Wales, in the Scottish Highlands, in parts of Ireland, that ancestry shows up as a genetic signal in populations that were themselves isolated, themselves pushed to the margins by later migrations. The Basques of northern Spain and southwestern France, as discussed in other contexts, preserve levels of ancient Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry that place them in the same conversation as Welsh and Scottish populations genetically. There are populations in northwestern Africa, specifically certain Berber communities in Morocco and the Atlas Mountains, that carry echoes of the same ancient ancestry. Tiny, ancient, barely detectable genetic threads connecting communities at the western and southwestern fringes of Europe and North Africa, that seem to speak to a world before the Great Migrations, a world when the Atlantic coast of Europe was populated by people whose descendants survive today only in the most geographically protected corners of each region. This ancient Atlantic fringe population, whatever they called themselves, whatever language they spoke, whatever they believed, may be the deepest foundation of what we recognize as distinctively British. Not the Celts, who arrived during the Bronze and Iron Ages, not the Anglo-Saxons, not the Normans, something older, something that predates every named people in every conventional history of Britain, something that survived in the genetic record precisely because Britain's geography made it harder to dilute than anywhere else. And it did not survive only in the genetics. Some researchers believe, controversially, but with supporting evidence, that certain elements of British culture, including some of the most distinctive and peculiar aspects of British culture, also trace back to this ancient Atlantic coast substrate. The megalithic monument tradition, Stonehenge, the Ring of Brodgar, Newgrange in Ireland, the standing stones of Carnac in Brittany, appears to have been an Atlantic phenomenon before it was a British one specifically. The communities that built these monuments shared practices, architectural styles, and potentially beliefs across a maritime world connected by the Atlantic coast long before the land routes of continental Europe carried other traditions westward. When the Bell Beaker people arrived and replaced most of the population in genetic terms, they appear to have adopted some of these monument traditions. The culture partially survived, even when the population largely did not. And certain aspects of that prehistorical Atlantic culture, the specific relationship to landscape, the specific attention to astronomical cycles that the megalithic monuments encode, the specific spiritual relationship to certain types of places and features in the natural world, may have persisted in Britain in diluted, transformed, partially recognizable forms all the way down into the folk traditions of the medieval and early modern period. This is speculation. Legitimate, evidence-adjacent speculation, but speculation nonetheless. What is not speculation is the following. The British Isles have been occupied continuously by humans for an extraordinarily long period of time, with only one major interruption during the height of the last ice age, when the glaciers pushed human populations entirely off the island. Every population that arrived during that long occupation left some trace. Some left enormous traces, the Bell Beaker people, the Anglo-Saxons, and some left almost none in the genetic record despite 4 centuries of cultural dominance, as the Romans demonstrated. The British population today is the product of all of those arrivals, all of those replacements, all of those partial absorptions and genetic preservations, filtered through the specific selective pressures of an island climate that is unusually cold, unusually wet, unusually dark for significant parts of the year, and unusually good at preserving human populations in semi-isolated regional pockets that prevented the final mixing that continental geography would have enforced. The result, the specific pattern of physical appearance that characterizes British people as a population, is therefore not the product of any single ancestral group. It is the product of deep time, of geography, of selection, of the specific accident that an island sat at exactly the right latitude and with exactly the right channel barrier history to preserve ancient genetic contributions that were erased elsewhere. while simultaneously selecting for the specific physical traits that island's light environment and diet and disease ecology demanded. But there is more to the story than genetics and natural selection, because Britain has not been shaped only by the biology of its inhabitants. It has been shaped by what those inhabitants believed, what they feared, what they imagined the world to be, and how those beliefs were themselves shaped by the specific strange landscape they inhabited. And the landscape of Britain, the specific character of its light, its weather, its hills, its coasts, is genuinely unlike anywhere else in Europe, in ways that go beyond the merely meteorological. There is a quality to British light that painters have been trying to capture for centuries. The particular way clouds move across the sky over the lowlands of East Anglia, the specific quality of evening light on the moors of Devon and Cornwall, the colours that open hillsides in Scotland take on in late afternoon in October. This is not romanticism or tourism, it is physics. The angle of Britain's latitude, combined with the Atlantic moisture that keeps the air perpetually humid and cloud-seeded, produces a light quality that is genuinely unlike the Mediterranean light of southern Europe or the flatter, a harder light of the continental interior. Artists as different as Constable and Turner were working in a tradition of struggling with the same problem: how to capture a light that was always changing, always softer than it looked, always doing something unexpected with colour and shadow. The Impressionist tradition that dominated European painting in the late 19th century, with its obsession with capturing the effects of light on landscape, found its most extreme expression in Britain, not France, because Britain's light was the most extreme problem, the hardest to pin down, the most variable, the most alive. And this quality of light shaped the people who lived in it in ways that are difficult to reduce to simple evolutionary mechanisms. It shaped how they understood the world. The British tendency toward a certain kind of pessimism, the famous understatement, the reluctance to claim that any situation is definitively good, the cultural preference for the phrase "not bad" over any unqualified positive, is sometimes attributed to culture, to history, to the peculiarities of class and empire and national temperament. But it may also be, in part, a response to a landscape that is genuinely uncertain in its moods. A landscape where the weather can change dramatically within an hour, where a summer can pass without a single reliable warm day, where the natural world is beautiful but not reliably benevolent. Living for thousands of generations in that landscape would do something to a population's collective psychology in ways that eventually, through cultural transmission, become ingrained enough to feel like character. The fog is not a metaphor in Britain. The fog is literal. For significant portions of the year, in significant portions of the country, the air itself is opaque. The horizon disappears. The world shrinks to the immediate, and the close, and the barely visible. Ancient British communities living in that fog could not rely on long sightlines for safety or navigation or hunting. They had to develop other senses, other ways of reading the environment by sound, by smell, by feel of the ground underfoot, by memory of the shape of terrain they could no longer see clearly. The specific attentiveness to detail, the specific kind of close observation of local environment that characterizes a great deal of traditional British culture, including, eventually, the empirical scientific tradition that emerged with unusual force from Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries, may be downstream in ways that are impossible to fully trace, but impossible to entirely dismiss. From 10,000 years of learning to navigate a world that frequently declined to be visually clear. The sea is never far in Britain. The longest distance from the coast anywhere in England is about 70 miles. In Scotland, with its fractured western coastline, you are rarely more than 40 miles from tidal water. This proximity to the sea did something to Britain that continental populations did not experience in the same way. The sea was both barrier and highway. It cut Britain off from easy overland communication with the continent, reducing gene flow and cultural diffusion from the east, preserving those ancient genetic and cultural elements we have been discussing. But it simultaneously opened Britain to maritime connections to Ireland, to the Atlantic coasts of France and Spain and Portugal, and eventually much further that continental interior populations could not access. Britain was simultaneously isolated and connected, but connected in the specific way that only maritime cultures can be, to other coastlines, to the specific network of peoples who lived along the Atlantic edge of the world and shared a relationship with the sea that was more fundamental than their relationship with any inland power. This maritime character shaped the British genetic story directly. The pre-agricultural populations that Britain is descended from were, in significant part, coastal peoples. They followed coastlines. They ate from the sea. The archaeological record of pre-agricultural Britain is disproportionately coastal, partly because coastlines offered dense resources in the form of shellfish and seabirds and marine mammals and coastal vegetation, and partly because the rising sea levels of the post-glacial period drowned the majority of inland archaeological sites, leaving us with a skewed sample that overrepresents coastal occupation. But the maritime orientation was real, not simply an artifact of preservation bias. The ancient peoples of Britain were sea people before they were anything else. And that maritime relationship embedded itself into the genetics of British populations, in the sense that the specific founding populations, with their specific genetic characteristics, were themselves products of a long Atlantic coast tradition. The connection between ancient Britain and the broader Atlantic world is one of the most underexplored aspects of British prehistory. For too long, the conventional narrative has presented Britain as a recipient of continental influences, as a place that received migrations and cultural innovations from the east and south, while contributing relatively little to the wider world, before the historical period. But the megalithic tradition tells a different story. The oldest megalithic monuments in the British Isles predate the pyramids by thousands of years and predate any comparable monumental architecture anywhere in continental Europe east of Brittany. These monuments, the construction of which required levels of social organization, engineering knowledge, and long-distance coordination that the conventional narrative of primitive prehistory cannot easily account for, suggest that the Atlantic coast world, of which ancient Britain was a part, was doing things that the continental interior was not yet doing. The question of where this capacity came from, and what the people who built these structures believed and thought and looked like, is one of the most genuinely open questions in British prehistory. And it is a question that connects, in ways that may be more than metaphorical, to the larger question of what Britain preserved that the rest of Europe did not. Because if the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury and the Ring of Brodgar were themselves descended from the ancient Atlantic populations who survived the last ice age along the southwestern coasts of Europe and North Africa, and the ancient DNA evidence is broadly consistent with this, then the distinctiveness of Britain's genetic heritage is ultimately the distinctiveness of the Atlantic world's most isolated and most preserved corner, the endpoint of a long chain of preservation. The place where the oldest genetic layers of European humanity survived, longest and in highest concentration, precisely because the sea that isolated Britain was wide enough to slow the migrations that diluted those layers elsewhere, but narrow enough that the island was never entirely cut off from the cultural and genetic exchanges that kept it connected to the broader human story. This is a story about geography, about time, about the specific accident of where an island sits on a map and how that position shapes the biology and the culture and the faces of every generation that lives there. It is not a simple story. It is not a story that fits neatly into any single discipline, not genetics, not archaeology, not physical anthropology, not cultural history. It is all of those things at once, braided together in the complicated way that human reality always insists on being braided, resistant to simple summary, full of detail and exception, and ongoing revision as new data emerges from new ancient DNA samples and new archaeological excavations and new analytical methods that can extract information from material that previous researchers assumed was beyond decoding. But the central thread is clear enough. The British population is different because it sits at the end of a particular chain of events that began at the edge of the last ice age and has never fully resolved into the kind of continental homogeneity that might have eventually made British faces look indistinguishable from German or French, or Polish faces. The channel protected, the terrain fragmented, the climate selected, and the ancient genetic contributions of the world's earliest Atlantic coast peoples survived in the frozen northwest corner of Europe in higher concentrations than anywhere else on Earth, preserved in the colouring and the bone structure and the eye colour of people who mostly have no idea they are carrying anything ancient at all. That invisibility of deep ancestry is part of what makes the British case so fascinating. These are not isolated communities that know themselves to be genetically unusual. These are people living in modern cities, watching the same television, eating the same food, embedded in the same global culture as everyone else. But written into their genomes, if you know how to read it, is a story that predates England by thousands of years. A story that predates the Celts. A story that predates farming. A story that begins with small bands of dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunters following reindeer herds across a frozen landscape that did not yet have a name, and that has been running, unbroken, ever since. The physical distinctiveness of British people is not, in other words, a product of isolation from the rest of humanity. It is a product of a specific, unusual, complicated history of selective preservation, the preservation of ancient things that were lost elsewhere, combined with selective inputs from successive waves of arrivals, filtered through the specific demands of an island climate that is unlike anywhere else in Europe. Every face in Britain contains that history, whether the person looking out of it knows it or not, and the question of why they look the way they do is inseparable from the question of what happened, in deep time, on this small, cold, fog-wrapped island at the edge of the Atlantic world. Which brings us to something the genetics cannot quite capture on their own. Because the physical appearance of British people is only the most visible marker of a deeper phenomenon, the phenomenon of what happens to a population over thousands of generations when it lives in a specific kind of relationship with a specific kind of landscape. And the landscape of Britain has been shaping more than faces. It has been shaping minds, shaping the specific character of attention and imagination and relationship to the natural world that eventually, after all the centuries of Christianity and empire and industrial revolution, we still recognize as something distinctively British, something that goes all the way down to the bone. The ancient Britons who built Stonehenge were not architects in any modern sense. They did not have written plans. They did not have metal tools. They did not have wheels, or at least not yet, though the question of whether some form of wheeled transport assisted the movement of the bluestones from Wales is still debated. What they had was an extraordinarily precise understanding of the movements of celestial bodies and how those movements related to events on the ground, the solstices, the equinoxes, the rising and setting points of the sun and moon at particular moments in the astronomical year. This understanding was not theoretical. It was practical, empirical, accumulated over generations of careful observation by people who needed to know when the seasons would change, when to plant, when to move livestock, when certain astronomical events would occur that held whatever religious significance those events held for them. Stonehenge is, among other things, a calendar, a machine for tracking astronomical time, built at enormous cost in labor and organization, because knowing where you were in the astronomical year was important enough to warrant that cost. This astronomical precision existed thousands of years before any formal science of astronomy existed anywhere in the world, and it was not limited to Stonehenge. The orientation of megalithic monuments to astronomical events is a consistent feature across Britain and Ireland and the Atlantic coasts of France and Spain, a distributed, widespread, apparently shared tradition of astronomical observation embedded in stone in ways that were meant to last. These were communities that understood that the stars were reliable and the weather was not, that the movements of celestial bodies could be trusted to predict seasonal changes in ways that cloud cover and temperature variation could not. And they encoded that understanding permanently in stone, in alignments, in structures that were designed to survive not just a generation but centuries or millennia of use. The question of what happened to that knowledge, whether it survived in any transmissible form through the upheavals of the Bronze Age population replacement and the Iron Age and the Roman conquest and the Anglo-Saxon settlement, is genuinely unanswerable with current evidence. What we can say is that the British tradition of careful empirical observation of the natural world has roots that are very, very deep. The particular character of British science, pragmatic, observational, suspicious of purely theoretical construction, committed to measurement and experiment over philosophical deduction, has been noted by historians of science as a distinctive national style that set British scientific culture apart from the more rationalist tradition of continental Europe during the scientific revolution. Whether that style has any meaningful connection to the ancient observational traditions of the megalith builders is unknowable, but the question is worth sitting with. Because the continuity of a population's fundamental cognitive tendencies, even as the specific content of culture changes completely, is something that evolutionary psychology takes seriously. Deep behaviors that were adaptive in a particular environment can persist in a population long after the original adaptive context has disappeared, carried not as genetic determinism, but as cultural transmission that reinforces and preserves tendencies that the underlying biology makes natural. Britain's specific environment made careful observation of natural cycles, weather, seasons, tides, astronomical events, a survival skill. It made close attention to the details of a landscape that was frequently obscured, frequently variable, frequently unpredictable, an essential cognitive style. It made community cooperation within small, semi-isolated regional groups the primary social structure for thousands of years. And the traces of all of these adaptive tendencies are still visible, if you look carefully, in the specific cultural and intellectual style that Britain has presented to the world over the centuries of its documented history. The empiricism, the pragmatism, the famous British attachment to local identity, the intense identification with specific places, with counties and cities and villages, which reflects the long history of regional semi-isolation that the terrain enforced. The humour, which is often built around close observation of specific detail, and the gap between expectation and reality. A cognitive style perfectly suited to a landscape that specializes in not quite delivering what it appears to promise. None of this is destiny. None of it is determinism. People are not imprisoned by their geography or their genetics, but they are shaped by them in ways that accumulate over thousands of years and express themselves in patterns that are real even when they are difficult to quantify. And the specific pattern of British physical appearance, the colouring, the bone structure, the range of variation, the regional differences, is the most visible surface of a much deeper pattern that goes all the way down through culture and history and psychology to the very bottom of what this island has been doing to its human inhabitants since the first hunters crossed Doggerland 14,000 years ago. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most books about British history do not make. Because everything we have discussed so far, the genetics, the selection pressures, the geographic isolation, the regional variation, all of that describes Britain's internal history. The forces that shape the British population from the inside, from the specific character of the island and its relationship with its inhabitants. But Britain also has an external history that is unlike the external history of almost any other nation on Earth. And that external history created feedback loops that came back around and shaped the British population in ways that are only now beginning to be understood. The British Empire, at its maximum extent in the early 20th century, covered approximately a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed approximately a quarter of the world's population. This was not a statistical curiosity. It was the largest empire in human history, and it meant that for a period of several centuries, Britain was doing something that had never been done before, extracting resources, people, animals, plants, diseases, and genetic material from every inhabited region of the planet and routing it through a small, cold, rainy island in the North Atlantic. The consequences of this for the people who were exploited by that empire are documented, catastrophic, and the subject of ongoing historical reckoning. The consequences for Britain itself, and specifically for the British population, are less discussed but no less real. Consider disease alone. The epidemiological history of Britain since the 16th century is the history of an island that was repeatedly introduced to pathogens from the rest of the world and that repeatedly had to develop immunological responses to those pathogens. The populations that colonial trade and slavery and conquest brought to Britain directly, or via the intermediate routes of the Caribbean and the Atlantic slave trade, introduced disease pressures that the British immune system had to respond to, reshaping allele frequencies in immune-related genes in ways that are only now being traced through large genomic datasets. The specific character of British immune function today reflects not just the ancient disease environment of the island, but the entire history of global pathogen exposure that the empire entailed. And then there is the direct genetic contribution of empire. This is discussed less often than it should be, partly because it sits uncomfortably alongside narratives about British racial purity that were never accurate but were politically powerful, and partly because the data to quantify it precisely has only recently become available. Modern genomic surveys of British populations consistently find small but real levels of ancestry from South Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, and East Asia, in communities across Britain, not just in the cities that received large 20th century immigration, but in populations with much older histories of contact with the wider world that the empire created. Sailors from West Africa and the Indian subcontinent were a presence in British port cities from at least the 17th century onward. Enslaved people brought to Britain as servants contributed genetic ancestry to British families in ways that were rarely acknowledged at the time and are only now being traced. The empire was not a one-way conduit. Britain exported people and power to the world, and the world sent genes back to Britain in quantities that were small but real and persistent. This genetic contribution of empire is visible today primarily in the major port cities London, Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, and in the communities that grew up around naval establishments and trading posts. It is not the dominant signal in modern British DNA by any means. The ancient founding populations and the Bronze Age replacements and the Anglo-Saxon migrations remain far more prominent in genomic ancestry analyses, but it is there. And it adds one more layer to the already complex story of what the British population is and where it came from. But the empire's most significant influence on the appearance of British people may not be genetic at all. It may be nutritional. The food environment of Britain was transformed by empire in ways that had direct consequences for the physical development of the population. Sugar, which became cheap and ubiquitous in Britain earlier than in most other European countries as a result of the Caribbean plantation economy, affected growth patterns, tooth formation, and metabolic profiles in the British population in ways that researchers are still quantifying. Tea, which became Britain's defining beverage so completely that it displaced ale as the default daily drink of the working population, introduced a cultural practice of daily fluid consumption that affected hydration patterns. The specific foods that empire brought into the British diet, from the potato, which transformed the caloric availability of the British and Irish poor, to the spices that made British food genuinely distinctive from continental European food, to, eventually, the curry house tradition that has given Britain a culinary identity that is simultaneously completely colonial and completely authentically British. All of these reshaped the physical environment within which British bodies developed across the centuries. The potato deserves special attention because its impact on the British and specifically Irish population was enormous. Introduced from the Americas in the 16th century, the potato reached Britain and Ireland and proved extraordinarily well suited to the wet, cool climate. It could be grown in poor soil that would not support grain crops. It produced more calories per acre than any other staple crop available in the British climate. And for the rural poor of Ireland especially, it became the overwhelming basis of the diet within a century of its introduction. The consequence was a population explosion. Irish and later English and Scottish rural populations expanded rapidly in the 17th and 18th centuries on the back of the potato's caloric density. The bodies of those populations, their height, their health indicators, their physical development reflected a diet that was calorie sufficient but nutritionally narrow. And when the potato blight of the 1840s destroyed the Irish potato crop and triggered the Great Famine, the demographic consequences, over 1 million deaths, over 1 million emigrants, a halving of Ireland's population within a decade, constituted one of the most dramatic population events in the history of the British Isles. The genetic consequences of the Great Famine are measurable in modern Irish and diaspora Irish populations. Bottleneck affects the reduced genetic diversity that occurs when a population is drastically reduced in size are detectable in genomic analyses of Irish populations compared to British populations that did not experience the same catastrophic reduction. This is yet another layer of the complex, specific, historically contingent story of why the populations of the British Isles look the way they look and are structured genetically the way they are structured. Not a simple story of ancestry and inheritance, but a story of catastrophe and selection, and the specific accidents of agricultural history and colonial economics and disease ecology that produced the modern populations we can observe and measure. And here we need to talk about something that popular discussions of British distinctiveness almost never address directly: which is the question of what happened in the centuries between the Roman withdrawal and the Norman conquest, the so-called Dark Ages, and why that period matters more than most people realize for the story of British faces and British bodies and British genetics. The conventional picture of post-Roman Britain is one of collapse, the withdrawal of the Roman administrative and military structure, the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons from Germany and Denmark, the retreat of the native Celtic-speaking population to the western and northern margins of the island, the establishment of small, squabbling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This picture is accurate as far as it goes, but it leaves out something crucial about the demographic scale of what happened. Recent ancient DNA research has quantified the Anglo-Saxon migration with a precision that was previously impossible. The conclusion is striking. In eastern England, the areas closest to the continent that received the heaviest Anglo-Saxon settlement, the incoming migrants and their descendants came to represent between 50 and 70% of the ancestry of modern populations in those regions. This is not a small elite takeover. This is a major population movement, comparable in genetic impact to the Bell Beaker replacement of the Neolithic farmers 2,000 years earlier. The native British population, the people who spoke the languages that would eventually become Welsh and Cornish and Cumbrian, did not disappear in eastern England. They contributed the other 30 to 50% of the ancestry that modern populations in those regions carry. But they were, in demographic terms, outnumbered and eventually linguistically assimilated. Their language was not transmitted to the majority population. What was transmitted was their genes. And their genes, in those Eastern English populations, carry the ancient British ancestry. We have been discussing the pre-Bronze Age components that trace back to the Neolithic farmers and, before them, to the original post-glacial hunter-gatherers. Those contributions did not disappear when the Anglo-Saxons arrived. They were incorporated, at various proportions, into the new population that emerged from the mixing of the two streams. And they carried with them, at lower frequencies than in the less mixed Western populations, some of the same physical characteristics, the particular pigmentation variants, the specific bone structure elements that in higher concentration in Wales and Scotland produce the most extreme versions of British physical distinctiveness. This is why there is no clean boundary within Britain between populations that look visually more Celtic and populations that look visually more Anglo-Saxon. The mixing happened thoroughly enough that both ancestral contributions are present everywhere, just in different proportions. A person in Norfolk with, say, 60% Anglo-Saxon ancestry and 40% ancient British ancestry will, in many cases, look virtually identical to a person in Yorkshire with 50% of each. The mixing threshold, below which the physical differences become perceptible, is well below the level of variation between different British regions. The variation that observers do perceive between, say, a classic Welsh face and a classic East Anglian face is real. It reflects real underlying genetic differences, but it is subtle enough that it requires aggregate comparison to be reliably detected, not individual inspection. The most striking physical variation in Britain, when you look carefully, is north-south rather than east-west. This is counterintuitive from the perspective of the historical narrative, which emphasizes the east-west division between Anglo-Saxon England and Celtic Wales and Scotland. But the north-south gradient in certain physical characteristics, height particularly, and certain aspects of cranial morphology is consistently documented in studies of British physical variation and appears to reflect a genuine underlying genetic gradient. Scottish populations, especially from the Highlands, show distinctly different physical profiles from English populations when measured aggregately. Irish populations show a different profile again. And these differences appear to reflect the genuine genetic distinctiveness that has been described throughout this exploration. The higher frequencies of ancient Atlantic coast ancestry in the north and west versus the higher frequencies of continental European Bronze Age and later Anglo-Saxon, Viking ancestry in the south and east. Height is a particularly interesting case. The famous tall Englishman stereotype, if it ever had any basis in reality, should probably have been tall Scandinavian-descended East Anglian, since height is positively correlated with the steppe ancestry that Anglo-Saxons and Vikings carried, and negatively correlated with the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that Welsh and Scottish populations preserve. The Celts of popular imagination, fierce warriors, dramatically built, towering over their enemies, were probably not taller than the Romano-British and pre-Roman British populations they in turn replaced. The real height variation in Britain tracks the Bronze Age and later Germanic migrations, not the Iron Age Celtic arrival. This is yet another case where the popular story inverts the real genetic history. Red hair is not exclusively or even primarily a Celtic trait. This is one of the most persistent and widely believed misconceptions about British genetic history. Red hair is associated in popular culture with Celtic peoples, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and the association has enough truth to it that it became a cliché. But red hair appears in populations that have nothing to do with the Celtic cultural tradition. It appears in Uzbekistan, in small pockets of the Middle East, in parts of South Asia. Within Europe, it is found in populations far outside the Celtic world. The reason it is associated with Celtic populations in Britain is not that the Celts brought it. The reason is that the Celtic populations of Britain, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scottish Highlanders preserved the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that carried the MC1R variants associated with red hair at higher frequency, because those populations were geographically isolated from the diluting effects of later eastern migrations. The red hair was already there, in the pre-Celtic population. The Celts moved into a population that had it and mixed with that population without completely replacing it. And the geographic isolation of the Celtic-speaking regions from the Anglo-Saxon and later Scandinavian migrations that might have further diluted the frequency meant that it survived at particularly high rates in those regions. The association of red hair with Celtic identity is therefore a geographic correlation, not a genetic causation. The ancient Atlantic coast people who carried the red hair variants were not Celts. They predated the Celts by thousands of years. All of this matters for the question of British distinctiveness in a specific way. It means that the physical traits most strongly associated with looking British, the pale skin, the red or very dark hair, the blue or green eyes, the particular range of intermediate pigmentation, are not the product of any historical period that is commonly discussed in histories of Britain. They are not Roman, not Saxon, not Norman, not Celtic in the sense that any of these terms refers to the named historical peoples who have been claimed as the ancestors of the British. They are older than all of those. They are, at their deepest root, the product of ancient Atlantic Europe, of a world that existed before writing, before recorded history, before any of the named peoples who have contested this island arrived on its shores. The British are, in other words, the heirs of a tradition that goes back to a time before there was a Britain, before there was a Europe in any meaningful cultural sense, before there were languages that we can read or beliefs that we can access through any surviving document. They carry, in their faces and their bodies, the accumulated genetic legacy of every population that has ever lived on this island, all the way back to the first hunters who crossed Doggerland from a continent that was being transformed by the same rising seas that would eventually isolate Britain from the rest of the world. Every feature, every trait, every characteristic that makes British populations recognizable in the aggregate, all of it is the residue of that extraordinarily long, extraordinarily complicated history, filtered through the specific demands of an island that was cold and wet and dark and isolated, just enough to preserve the old and different and ancient, just enough to keep something from being fully mixed away into the continental average. This is a story about faces, but it is really a story about time, about how long human populations carry the marks of events they have completely forgotten, about how the landscape shapes the people who live in it, in ways that persist for thousands of years after the original selecting pressure has been diluted or transformed or made irrelevant by the march of civilization. About how an island, by the simple fact of being an island, by being surrounded by water that slows the movement of genes from one place to another, can preserve, in its human inhabitants, something that the mainland lost 10,000 years ago. The specific face of Britain is, at its most fundamental level, a face shaped by ice, by the specific retreat of the glaciers in a particular pattern that left particular populations in particular refugia and opened particular migration routes, by the specific geography of a channel that was wide enough to be a barrier and narrow enough to be crossable, by the specific latitude of an island that sits just far enough north to make vitamin D production a survival challenge without sitting so far north that the challenge becomes insurmountable. by the specific oceanic climate that keeps the air wet and the light filtered and the temperature moderate in ways that selected for specific physical traits while simultaneously making others unnecessary or counterproductive. There is no single answer to why British people look the way they look. There is only this: a long chain of causes, beginning at the end of the Ice Age and running through the present, each link of which added something or preserved something or selected for something that left its mark on the physical characteristics of the population. The genetics are part of that story. The climate is part of that story. The history of migration and invasion and isolation is part of that story. The specific dietary and disease environments are part of that story. And the longest part of the story, the deepest, the most ancient, the most poorly understood, is the story of the people who were here before any of the named groups arrived. The people who crossed Doggerland and fished the cold North Sea and built shelters against the perpetual damp and survived on the specific resources of this specific island, and who, in doing so, set the genetic and cultural template on which everything else was subsequently written. Those people are mostly invisible to us now. They left no written records. Their language is gone so completely that we have no idea what family it might have belonged to, whether it was related to anything that survived, whether it was a linguistic dead end or the root of something that persisted in some form. Their beliefs are reconstructed from the stone monuments they left behind and the burial goods that survived in their graves, and both of those sources are ambiguous enough that researchers have been arguing about their meaning for over a century without reaching consensus. Their faces can be reconstructed, imperfectly, from ancient DNA and forensic facial reconstruction, and what those reconstructions show are faces that would be recognizable as British in some respects and startling in others, combining features that modern Britons have in different combinations, but rarely as the specific combination that characterized those ancient people. And yet they are there, in every British face, at varying proportions. Cheddar Man's descendants, if we can call them that loosely, the ancient Atlantic coast population that survived in Britain's genetic pool long after it was diluted or extinguished elsewhere, are still present. Still visible, if you know what to look for. Still shaping, in subtle ways, the specific character of the population that lives on this island today. The eyes that seem to have no obvious continental European analogue. The hair colours that seem to exist in a slightly different distribution than anything you find on the other side of the channel. The bone structure that looks, in certain lights, in certain regional clusters, almost like something from a world that is much older than the named histories of Europe. Britain is an archive. Its people carry in their biology the accumulated record of 10,000 years of human habitation, filtered through the specific demands of an island that preserved the old and absorbed the new without ever fully resolving the tension between them. The question of why British people look different from every other nation on Earth is ultimately a question about what it means to live, for an extraordinarily long period of time, on a small cold island at the edge of the world. And the answer, when you finally reach it, is simpler and stranger than anything the official histories tell you. They look the way they look because of where they are, because of what the island did to the people who lived on it, because of the specific, unrepeatable accident of geography and time and climate that made Britain the place it is. The ice retreated, the seas rose, Doggerland drowned, and a small, cold, fog-wrapped island was cut off from the rest of Europe, left to preserve in its people something ancient enough that we do not yet have a name for it. Something that shows up, still, in the specific blue of certain British eyes, in the particular shade of certain British hair, in the slight difference in face shape that you feel, more than see, when you walk through a British city and then walk through a continental European one and try to put your finger on what is different, something that predates the Celts, that predates the Bronze Age, that predates agriculture and civilization and every named historical category we have ever used to describe the population of this island. Something that is still here, still running through the bloodstream of British people today, still making the British look, in aggregate, like no other nation on earth. That is the real reason. And it is stranger and older and more beautiful than anything anyone has told you about it. Now here is something that deepens everything we have been discussing. Because the physical distinctiveness of British people is not merely a matter of genetics and climate and the specific accident of island geography. It is also a matter of what happened over thousands of years between the British population and the specific, peculiar landscape they inhabited, a landscape unlike anywhere else in Europe, with consequences for the people that lived in it that go far beyond the merely biological. Britain's landscape is violent, not in the dramatic volcanic sense of Iceland or the earthquake-shattered sense of Japan, but in the subtle, persistent sense of a landscape that is always changing, always moving, always doing something unexpected with water and weather and terrain. The coastlines of Britain are some of the most actively eroded in the world. Entire villages have fallen into the sea along the Suffolk coast, within living memory. The cliffs of Yorkshire lose meters every decade to wave action. Storm surges push seawater kilometers inland across the flat fens of eastern England. Floods are not occasional disasters in Britain but regular features of the annual cycle in many regions. The land itself is not stable. It is dynamic, unstable at the margins, always negotiating with the sea over where exactly the boundary between land and water falls. Living for thousands of generations on a landscape with this character does something to a population's fundamental relationship with permanence and change. Communities that built too close to eroding coastlines lost everything within a few generations and learned through painful experience, encoded into cultural memory, that the landscape could not be trusted to remain where it was. The specific British relationship to change, the combination of reluctant conservatism and genuine adaptability, the famous muddling through, the preference for incremental adjustment over revolutionary transformation may have roots in this deep geological reality. A landscape that was always slowly changing required a population that could adapt to change without being destroyed by it, that could hold on to what was valuable while releasing what was no longer sustainable. The specific balance point of British cultural temperament, resistant to rapid change, but capable of adaptation when the alternative was catastrophic, might be, at some deep level, an encoded response to living on a landscape that made both excessive rigidity and excessive flexibility dangerous. The specific quality of British winters is something that anyone who has not experienced them cannot fully imagine from description. They are not dramatically cold in the way that Scandinavian or Russian winters are cold. The temperature rarely drops far below freezing for extended periods in most of Britain. But the persistent grey cold, the damp that penetrates everything, the perpetual overcast that makes a sunny day in January genuinely remarkable, that specific quality of British cold is a uniquely miserable thing, and it has been shaping the bodies and psychologies of British people for 10,000 years. The specific body adaptations that evolved in Britain, the tendency towards slightly higher body fat percentages than Mediterranean populations, the specific metabolic adjustments that evolved to extract maximum nutrition from diets that were calorie sufficient but often nutritionally variable, reflect the specific demands of surviving British winters in a pre-industrial environment where central heating did not exist and where the difference between adequate insulation and inadequate insulation was, in the worst winters, the difference between life and death. The specific cognitive style of British introversion, the famous British reserve, the cultural preference for indirect communication, the tendency to process internally before communicating externally, has been variously attributed to culture, to class structure, to the particular history of empire and its aftermath. But it may also reflect, in part, the cognitive demands of surviving in a landscape that was frequently threatening in ways that required careful internal processing before external action. A landscape where the weather could change suddenly and dangerously, where the sea could turn from calm to lethal within hours, where the terrain in many regions was complex enough that overconfident navigation could have fatal consequences. Under those conditions, the cognitive style that processed information thoroughly before committing to action that resisted the impulsive response in favor of the considered one would have had genuine survival value. The famous British pause before speaking, the reluctance to commit before all the information is in, the preference for understatement that leaves room for revision. These may be, at their deepest root, the cognitive style of a people who learned, over thousands of generations, that the landscape they inhabited rewarded caution and punished overconfidence. None of this is deterministic. None of it is destiny. The people of Britain today are shaped by all of recorded history, by empire and industrial revolution and 2 world wars, and the extraordinary transformations of the 20th century, in ways that swamp any ancient genetic or climatic inheritance. Modern Britain is a global society in ways that the ancient Britons could not have imagined. Its physical and cultural distinctiveness is constantly being revised by immigration, by cultural exchange, by the specific accidents of contemporary history. The Britain of 2024 is not the Britain of 1024 or 924 BC. The population changes, the culture changes, the faces change as new genetic contributions arrive and mix with existing ones, producing in each generation a slightly different distribution of physical characteristics. But underneath all of that change, underneath the layers of historical accident and cultural revision and demographic shift, the ancient foundations remain. The genetic contributions of the Bell-Beaker people, the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that survived in the western and northern margins, the specific selections that the island's climate imposed on every population that lived on it long enough, the regional variation that the terrain enforced, keeping populations slightly separate in ways that preserve differences that a flat continental geography would have smoothed away. All of that is still there, still visible, in aggregate, in the specific character of British physical appearance, still producing the faces that observers have been noting as subtly distinctive for as long as there have been observers comparing them to their continental counterparts. And there is one final layer to this story that we have not yet addressed, one that is perhaps the most speculative, but also the most haunting. The question of what the ancient populations of Britain believed, what they feared, what they imagined the world to be, and whether any of that, any fragment of the cosmology of the people who built Stonehenge and painted the bodies of their dead with red ochre and buried their honoured dead in chambers that were aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, whether any of that survived, the catastrophic population, replacements of the Bronze Age and the cultural upheavals of the Iron Age and the Roman period and the Anglo-Saxon arrival, and whether it persists in any recognisable form in the British cultural tradition today. The megalithic builders of prehistoric Britain were, by every measure we can apply, sophisticated people. They organised labour on a scale that required extensive social coordination. They possessed astronomical knowledge precise enough to orient major architectural structures to within fractions of a degree of specific celestial events. They maintained traditions that were consistent enough across centuries and across hundreds of kilometres to produce recognisable similarities between monuments in Orkney and monuments in Cornwall. Whatever belief system sustained this tradition, whatever understanding of the relationship between human communities and the natural world, between the living and the dead, between the present moment and the cycles of astronomical time that the monuments tracked, it was coherent enough and compelling enough to persist across generations and to motivate the extraordinary investment of effort that the monuments represent. That tradition was disrupted, possibly catastrophically, by the Bell-Beaker replacement around 2400 BC. The new population adopted some of the existing monuments. Stonehenge in particular appears to have been significantly modified during the early Bronze Age, at exactly the period when the Bell-Beaker people were establishing their dominance, but the cultural context within which those monuments had been built was gone, replaced by a different tradition with different concerns and different relationships to landscape and cosmos. Whatever the megalith builders had believed, whatever they had understood about the world, was no longer the dominant cultural reality of the island. But things survive in the margins, in the stories that children tell each other, in the practices that persist in rural communities long after their original justifications have been forgotten, in the specific character of the relationship to landscape and nature that particular communities maintain without necessarily knowing why. Some researchers have pointed to the persistence in British folk tradition, particularly in the Celtic-speaking regions of Britain and Ireland, of beliefs and practices that seem to echo, in distorted and Christianized forms, elements of a pre-Christian cosmology that may be very ancient indeed. The fairy tradition, with its specific geography of otherworldly places and its specific rules about how humans should interact with non-human intelligences embedded in the landscape, has features that parallel shamanic traditions documented in many parts of the world, traditions that in some cases can be traced back to the Mesolithic. The specific British and Irish relationship to certain kinds of landscape, the sense that particular hills, particular springs, particular ancient trees are somehow inhabited, somehow more than merely physical may carry, in however diluted and transformed a form, a faint trace of the animistic worldview of the people who built the stone circles and who understood the landscape as a network of relationships between human and non-human consciousness. This is deeply speculative territory. The evidence cannot be tested in the way that genetic evidence can be tested. Cultural survival over thousands of years, across multiple population replacements and religious transformations, is possible but impossible to prove through any direct chain of transmission. What we can say is that the specific character of the British imaginative tradition, its relationship to landscape, its tendency to find the natural world inhabited with presence and significance, its specific blend of the empirical and the uncanny, the scientific and the mysterious, has features that make sense in the context of a very long, very deep history of human habitation of a specific landscape. A history that goes back far enough that it predates every named tradition in every documented record, and that therefore must, if it left any cultural residue at all, have left it in the margins and the folk memory and the specific intuitions about landscape and nature and the non-human world that persist in British culture in ways that have never been fully explained by anything in recorded history. The British look different, they carry something ancient, and they live in a landscape that has been shaping them, generation by generation, for longer than the pyramids have existed. The story of why they look the way they look is ultimately the story of all of that, the ice and the genetics and the climate and the ancient populations and the long chain of events that left them standing at the end of the Atlantic world as the inheritors of the oldest human tradition in northwestern Europe. Different not because they chose to be different, different because the island made them so and then kept them that way and wrote the evidence of it in their faces. And that, all of that, is the real reason. There is something worth sitting with here as we come to the end of this particular thread of the story. Because the question we started with, why did the British look different from every other nation on Earth, seems, when you first encounter it, like it might have a simple answer. An answer about genetics, or about the Celts, or about the specific history of invasion and settlement that everyone learns in school. But when you follow it all the way down, when you trace it back through 10,000 years of human habitation of a cold island at the edge of Europe, what you find is not a simple answer at all. What you find is a layered, complicated, still unresolved story that implicates everything geology and climate and ancient DNA and natural selection and the specific history of migration and isolation and the peculiar accidents of geography that made Britain both connected to the wider world and insulated from the full force of the world. Migrations that reshaped the rest of Europe multiple times over. The people who live on the British Isles today are the product of that entire story. Every face reflects it, in some proportion. Every British person carries, in their genome, traces of the ancient populations who fished the cold North Sea and built the stone circles and crossed Doggerland in the cold dawn of the post-glacial world. Those traces are mixed with traces of Neolithic farmers and Bell Beaker, steppe people and Iron Age Celts and Romans who left almost nothing behind, and Anglo-Saxons who left an enormous amount, and Vikings who left a different kind of mark, and Normans who changed the culture more than the genetics. All of those layers are present. All of them contributed something. But underneath all of them, barely detectable in most people and unmistakable in others, is the oldest layer, the deepest foundation, the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that Britain preserved when the rest of Europe diluted it away. That layer is why British people look the way they look when you compare them carefully, population, to their closest continental neighbours. It is the residue of deep time, of 10,000 years of selective preservation, of a geography that was just isolated enough to keep something ancient alive. The ice retreated 14,000 years ago, and the first people crossed into a land that did not yet have a name. Everything that has happened since then is written in the faces of the people who live there today. The specific pale skin, the specific hair colours, the specific eyes that seem to have no exact parallel anywhere else in Europe. All of it saying, if you know how to read it, something happened here a very long time ago, and it has not finished happening yet. And maybe that is the deepest answer of all. Britain is still being made. The story is not over. Every generation adds its own contribution to the accumulated genetic and cultural record of this island, and every generation inherits something from all the ones that came before. The British face is not a finished thing. It is a process. A long, slow, still unfolding process that began at the edge of the Ice Age and is continuing right now, in the faces of children born today on a small, cold island at the edge of the Atlantic world. Children who carry, without knowing it, the genetic signatures of hunters who crossed a land bridge that no longer exists, of farmers who came from the east and transformed the landscape, of Bronze Age migrants from the Pontic steppe who replaced almost everyone who came before them, of Celts and Romans and Saxons and Vikings and Normans and all the others who have made this island what it is. And who will pass all of that on, in different combinations, to the children who come after them, adding one more generation to the 10,000-year chain that connects the first inhabitants of Britain to whatever the British will become next. That is who the British are. That is where they come from. And that is why, standing in a crowd in any British city, you feel something you cannot quite put into words. Something subtly but persistently different from what you feel standing in a crowd in Paris or Berlin or Warsaw. You are not imagining it. It is real. It is old. And now you know where it comes from. Let us go back even further, because the story of British distinctiveness does not actually begin with the first humans who crossed Doggerland. It begins much earlier than that. It begins with the geology of the island itself, with the specific accident of plate tectonics that positioned a particular piece of continental crust at a particular latitude in a particular relationship to the Atlantic Ocean and to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream current, creating the specific climate that would ultimately shape everything about the human populations that would eventually come to live on it. Britain's geology is extraordinarily varied for such a small piece of land. The oldest rocks in Britain, the Lewisian gneiss of the northwestern Scottish Highlands, are among the oldest exposed rocks on the surface of the Earth. They are nearly 3 billion years old. The young volcanic rocks of some Scottish islands are geologically recent by comparison. Between those extremes, Britain contains an almost implausible diversity of geological formations: limestone and sandstone and chalk and basalt and granite and slate and metamorphic rocks of every description, all packed into an area that in the continental United States would constitute a relatively small region. This geological diversity is not merely an interesting fact for geographers. It had direct consequences for the human populations that lived on this island, because different rock types produce different soils, different drainage patterns, different agricultural possibilities, different natural resources, and ultimately different economic and demographic histories for the communities that settled on them. The chalk downs of southern England, the long curving ridges of the North and South Downs, the Chilterns, the Marlborough Downs, the Downs of Dorset and Wiltshire produced light, free-draining soils that were easy to work with the simple agricultural tools of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. These regions became early centres of agricultural settlement and population growth. They are the regions where the highest densities of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments cluster, where Stonehenge and Avebury sit, where the long barrows of the Cotswolds and the chalk escarpment were built in their hundreds. The geology made the soil workable. The workable soil attracted settlement. The settlement created the population density that made monument construction possible. The heavy clay lowlands of the English Midlands were a different matter. Those soils required metal ploughshares to cultivate effectively, tools that did not become available until the Iron Age at the earliest. Before the development of iron agriculture, the clay lowlands were largely forested and thinly settled. They became productive agricultural land only relatively recently in the long timeline of British habitation, and their late agricultural development meant that they received their primary agricultural colonization from the Anglo-Saxon settlers of the post-Roman period, who were the people with the technology to farm them effectively. The distribution of Anglo-Saxon settlement in the early medieval period tracks the distribution of clay lowlands with remarkable precision, not because the Anglo-Saxons preferred clay, but because the clay lowlands were the available frontier at the moment when Anglo-Saxon agricultural technology arrived. This interaction between geology and demography, between the specific character of the landscape and the specific history of who settled where, when, and with what technology created the regional, genetic, and cultural patchwork that characterizes Britain today. The Chalk Downs were settled earliest and experienced the most continuous succession of populations, each arriving and partially replacing or absorbing the last. The clay lowlands were settled most intensively during the Anglo-Saxon period. The Highland zones, the Welsh mountains, the Scottish Highlands, the Pennines, the moors of Devon and Cornwall resisted large-scale agricultural settlement of any period and therefore preserved older population patterns with much greater fidelity. The map of British regional genetic variation follows the contour lines of the geology with a precision that would have been difficult to predict from first principles, but that makes perfect sense once you understand the mechanisms. And the chalk, specifically, produced something remarkable that has no parallel elsewhere in Britain, an archaeologically unparalleled record of human occupation going back to the Neolithic. The chalk preserves organic material under certain conditions. The fine, dry, alkaline chemistry of chalk soils slows the decay of bone, antler, shell, and other materials that would disappear rapidly in the acidic soils of the highland zones. This is why we know more about the Neolithic and Bronze Age populations of southern England than about almost any other prehistoric population in northwestern Europe. Not because southern England was more important or more intensively occupied, but because the chalk preserved the evidence while the acid highland soils destroyed it. Our picture of ancient Britain is therefore systematically biased toward the chalk zones, toward the specific communities who happen to live on a specific type of geology, and the populations of the highland zones, who left most of their remains in conditions that rapidly destroyed the organic evidence, are systematically underrepresented in our understanding of British prehistory. This preservation bias matters for our story because it means that the physical characteristics of the people we can study most easily from ancient Britain, the people whose DNA we can extract and sequence from Neolithic and Bronze Age bones, are primarily from the chalk lowland populations. The people of the highland zones, who may have been physically distinct in important ways, are largely invisible to the ancient DNA record, except where unusual preservation conditions happen to protect their remains. The picture we have of what ancient Britons looked like is therefore inevitably a chalk lowland picture, weighted toward the eastern and southern populations that received the heaviest subsequent admixture from continental migrations. The ancient populations of Wales and Scotland, who may have been among the most genetically distinctive in terms of preserving ancient Atlantic coast ancestry, are represented by relatively few ancient DNA samples, leaving exactly the populations that might tell us the most about deep British prehistory as the ones about which we know the least. But what the ancient DNA from southern England does tell us, even with this bias, is remarkable enough. It tells us that the population of Britain before the Bell Beaker replacement was itself the product of a long history of successive arrivals and partial replacements going back to the first post-glacial colonization. It tells us that those populations were physically different in ways we would immediately recognize from their genetics: darker skin, different hair color distributions, different bone structure from what followed. It tells us that the transformation of British physical appearance from something closer to the ancient Atlantic coast populations to something closer to the modern British population happened relatively rapidly, within a few hundred years of the Bell Beaker arrival, and that this transformation was driven primarily by population replacement rather than natural selection or cultural change. The British did not gradually evolve to look the way they look today. They were replaced, in a very significant part, by people who already looked more like what modern British people look like, and then that new population was further modified by subsequent arrivals and by the ongoing selective pressures of the island environment. This is a deeply unsettling finding for anyone who has a stake in the idea of continuous British identity stretching back to time immemorial. The people who built Stonehenge were not the ancestors, in any straightforward genetic sense, of the people who live near Stonehenge today. Their monument was adopted and modified by a new population that arrived and replaced them. That new population then became the substrate on which all subsequent British history was built. But even that population, the Bell Beaker people and their descendants, was not static. It was modified by subsequent migrations, most significantly by the Anglo-Saxons, who added a substantial continental European component to the genetic makeup of Eastern Britain, and then by the Vikings, who added another, and then by the constant low-level gene flow across the channel that has been occurring throughout historical time, never replacing the British population wholesale, but consistently adding small amounts of continental European ancestry that slightly shifted the genetic average with each generation. All of this adds up to a population that is genuinely complex, that cannot be reduced to any single ancestral narrative. That contains, in varying proportions in different individuals and different regions, contributions from every major population movement that has affected the British Isles over the past 14,000 years. And that, in its visual, physical appearance, reflects the specific combination of those contributions that each individual happened to receive, a combination that is never quite the continental European average, because the island's geography prevented the full homogenization that would have produced that average, and because certain ancient contributions survived in Britain at higher frequencies than anywhere else. The question of what this means for British identity, for the way British people understand themselves and their relationship to their history, is one that has become increasingly pointed as ancient DNA research has revealed just how recent and how transformative the Bell Beaker population replacement was. There is a natural human desire to connect with ancient populations of the place where one lives, to see the people who built Stonehenge as ancestors, as part of the same continuous tradition. And in a certain sense, that desire is not entirely misguided. The Bell Beaker people who arrived and replaced the megalith builders did adopt some of the existing cultural infrastructure, modifying and continuing the use of monuments that the previous population had built. Cultural continuity does not require biological continuity, and the monuments of Neolithic Britain are part of the cultural heritage of everyone who has lived on this island since, regardless of what the genetics show about population turnover. But the genetics do matter for understanding why British people look the way they look, because the physical characteristics of modern British people are much more the product of the Bell Beaker replacement and subsequent migrations than they are the product of the ancient Atlantic coast populations who built the megalithic monuments. The ancient Atlantic coast ancestry is still there, preserved at higher frequencies in the west and north, detectable in the genetics of Welsh and Scottish populations, still influencing certain physical characteristics across the British population generally. But the primary template for modern British appearance was set by the Bronze Age arrivals from the steppe, modified by subsequent migrations, and then filtered through the island's selective environment for 3,500 years. And here is where the story becomes genuinely philosophically interesting. Because the Bell Beaker people who set that primary template were themselves not a single ancestral group. They were the product of a migration that had swept across continental Europe in the centuries before they arrived in Britain, picking up genetic contributions from multiple earlier populations as they moved. They carried steppe ancestry from the Pontic Caspian grasslands, farmer ancestry from the continental Neolithic agricultural populations they moved through and mixed with, and hunter-gatherer ancestry from the ancient European populations that predated the farmers. By the time they reached Britain, they were already a mixed population, a mixture that had its own specific character, its own specific distribution of physical characteristics, its own relationship to the ancient populations whose territory they were entering. And Britain then did to them what it does to everyone who arrives. It preserved them in a slightly modified form while continuing to add small, additional contributions from subsequent arrivals, so that the modern British population is the Bell Beaker mixture, plus Anglo-Saxon admixture, plus Viking admixture, plus small amounts of everything else that has arrived over the millennia, all filtered through the specific selective pressures of the island's climate and diet and disease environment, all preserved in regional pockets by the terrain's tendency to fragment populations into semi-isolated communities that maintained their specific mixture for longer than continental geography would have allowed. The result is a population that is, in genomic terms, somewhere between the continental European populations it is most closely related to, primarily northwestern, French, Dutch, and German populations, and something that is distinctly its own. Not so different that it is obviously a separate genetic cluster by the standards of global human variation. The differences between British and continental northwestern European populations are small compared to the differences between either of them and, say, East Asian or Sub-Saharan African populations, but measurably, consistently, reproducibly different in ways that show up in large genomic analyses and that correspond to the specific historical processes we have been describing. That measurable difference is what people perceive when they feel that British people look subtly distinct. They are not wrong. The perception corresponds to a real genomic reality. The difference is subtle but genuine. And it is the product of everything this story has described. The ancient Atlantic coast foundations, the Bell-Beaker transformation, the island's geographic isolation and climatic selection pressures, the regional fragmentation and preservation, the Anglo-Saxon and Viking additions, the small subsequent contributions of every migration and trade connection and imperial entanglement that brought new genetic material to the island across the subsequent centuries. Let us turn now to something that the genetics, fascinating as they are, cannot fully explain on their own. The question of what the British landscape did not just to British bodies, but to British minds over the centuries of human habitation. And, specifically, the question of why Britain produced, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the specific intellectual tradition that became the foundation of modern science, empirical, experimental, pragmatic, suspicious of purely theoretical reasoning with a consistency and density that has never been fully explained by historians of ideas who try to account for it purely through cultural and institutional factors. The scientific revolution happened across Europe, not just in Britain. Galileo was Italian, Descartes was French, Kepler and Leibniz were German. The intellectual transformation that gave the world modern natural science was a pan-European phenomenon with contributions from every major intellectual tradition. But the specific branch of that tradition that emphasized experiment over theory, observation over deduction, practical application over philosophical system, building the branch associated with Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle and John Locke and Isaac Newton, and eventually the entire tradition of British empiricism was distinctively British in its concentration and its cultural influence. It shaped the Industrial Revolution, which happened first in Britain. It shaped the tradition of British engineering, which produced the specific practical genius that built the railways and the steam engines and the machinery of the modern world. And it shaped the British scientific tradition that, across the 19th and 20th centuries, produced a disproportionate number of fundamental scientific discoveries relative to Britain's size and population. Why? The standard explanations invoke the institutional factors, the Royal Society, the tradition of gentlemanly science, the specific economic incentives created by British trade and empire. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They do not explain why Britain developed the specific intellectual culture that made those institutions effective, why the empiricist tendency was already present in British intellectual life before the institutions that supposedly produced it existed, why the practical, observational, experimental cast of mind that characterized British science appears in British intellectual culture in forms that predate the scientific revolution by centuries. One answer, not the complete answer, but part of it is the one we have been building throughout this exploration. The specific cognitive style that makes empiricism natural close observation of specific phenomena, resistance to overgeneral theoretical claims, preference for the particular over the universal, willingness to revise conclusions in the face of new evidence is a cognitive style that a population living in Britain's specific landscape would have been developing. In practical survival applications, for 10,000 years before anyone thought to apply it to formal natural philosophy. The British landscape demands close attention to specific local conditions, because those conditions are highly variable, and the consequences of getting them wrong can be severe. It rewards the person who has learned the specific idiosyncrasies of a specific piece of terrain and knows from careful observation when the weather is about to turn, and which areas flood, and which paths stay passable in winter. It does not reward the person who has developed an elegant general theory about the relationship between clouds and rainfall, if that theory does not account for the specific microclimate of the specific valley where they live. This is not determinism. It is not an argument that British people are inherently more empirical than other people by some biological necessity. It is an argument that a particular cognitive style was adaptively reinforced in the British population over thousands of years of living in a landscape that rewarded it, and that this reinforcement was culturally transmitted, generation by generation, through practices and habits and ways of engaging with the world that eventually expressed themselves, when the circumstances were right, in the formal intellectual tradition of British empiricism. The landscape did not directly produce Isaac Newton, but the landscape produced a culture that was, when Newton came along, unusually well prepared to recognize the value of what he was doing and to build on it. There is a tradition in British thought, explicit in some thinkers, implicit in many more of trusting observation over authority, of privileging what you can see and measure over what any text tells you ought to be the case, of remaining skeptical of elegant theoretical systems that promise more certainty than the messy evidence actually warrants. This tradition is not universal in British thought. There are British thinkers who are as committed to abstract theoretical systems as any continental rationalist. But the tradition is distinctively prominent, distinctively influential, distinctively characteristic of the mainstream of British intellectual culture in a way that does not have a precise parallel in any other European intellectual tradition. And it connects to a feature of the British character that is noticed by almost every foreigner who spends significant time in Britain: the specific quality of British humour. British humour is, at its best, a form of empiricism. It notices the gap between what things are supposed to be and what they actually are. It is fundamentally about deflating pretension, about noticing when a claim to grandeur or significance is not supported by the available evidence. The deadpan observation that something is not quite right or not entirely satisfactory as a response to catastrophic failure is funny precisely because it is applying the empirical standard assessing what is actually the case and reporting it accurately in a social context that normally requires the inflation of reality. British humour is observation taken to its logical extreme, the tool of close attention applied to social reality with the same ruthlessness that a scientist applies to experimental data. This connection between empiricism and humour, between the specific cognitive style of the British scientific tradition and the specific character of British comedy, is not usually noted in either the history of science or the dual history of comedy. But it is real. It reflects a single underlying cognitive tendency, the preference for the specific and observed over the general and assumed that expresses itself differently depending on the domain of application. In science, it produces experiments and data and skepticism about theoretical overreach. In comedy, it produces the raised eyebrow and the perfectly timed pause and the devastating observation that everyone was thinking but nobody said. Both of these are, at their root, products of attention, of the specific quality of close, patient, non-committing observation that Britain's landscape has been selecting for in its human inhabitants for 10,000 years. The same attention that Cheddarman's people applied to reading a landscape for signs of game and water and shelter, the same attention that the megalith builders applied to reading the sky for astronomical patterns, the same attention that every generation of British farmers and sailors and craftspeople applied to their specific domain, developing through practice and transmission the specific quality of careful, evidence-based, revision-ready attention that eventually expressed itself in formal science and in formal comedy. If you want to understand why British people look different, you eventually end up here. Not just in the genetics and the climate and the geography, but in this: the specific quality of mind that 10,000 years of living on a difficult, beautiful, fog-wrapped, perpetually surprising island produced. A mind that is attentive to the specific and suspicious of the general, that is patient with ambiguity and resistant to premature conclusion, that finds beauty in the observable world and humour in the gap between expectation and reality, that has been shaped by its landscape, generation by generation, into something that is like the faces it inhabits subtly, persistently, genuinely different from what you find anywhere else. The faces are the surface. The landscape is the depth, and between the two, 10,000 years of human life on a cold island at the edge of the world. Now, there is something worth examining that most discussions of British physical distinctiveness carefully avoid, perhaps because it touches on topics that are politically sensitive, but which are scientifically fascinating and historically essential for a complete account of the phenomenon we are investigating. That is the question of why Britain, of all the islands of the world, became the center of the largest empire in human history, and whether that empire's origins say something about the specific character of the population it came from, something rooted not in any claim of inherent superiority, which the genetics absolutely do not support and which history has thoroughly discredited, but in the specific combination of geographic position, genetic history, and culturally transmitted cognitive style that Britain's particular situation produced. The British Empire was built on ships. Everything else came after the ships. The specific maritime genius that allowed British navigators and engineers and merchants to build the most powerful seafaring force the world had ever seen was not supernatural. It was the product of a long tradition of maritime culture in a population that had always lived close to the sea, that had always relied on the sea for part of its sustenance and connection to the wider world, and that had been developing maritime knowledge and technology continuously since the ancient populations of the Atlantic coast first began exploiting the rich coastal resources of the North Sea and the Irish Sea and the English Channel. Britain's maritime tradition does not begin with the age of exploration. It does not begin with the English Channel or the medieval period or even the Roman era. It begins with the post-glacial colonization of the island, with the first boats that crossed the Channel after Doggerland drowned, with the maritime bell beaker culture that spread archaeological artifacts and genetic ancestry along the Atlantic coast, from the Iberian Peninsula to Scotland, with the Bronze Age and Iron Age sea routes that connected Britain to Ireland and Brittany and the wider Atlantic world. By the time historical records begin to describe British maritime activity, the tradition was already thousands of years old. The specific technical knowledge, the accumulated wisdom about tides and currents and weather patterns and navigation in the specific waters of northwestern Europe, had been building for millennia. And that tradition, that ancient, accumulated, deep-rooted maritime knowledge, was part of what enabled the expansion that eventually became the British Empire. Not the whole story, not even the most important part of the story, since the empire also required specific historical accidents and specific economic drivers and specific political circumstances that were contingent rather than determined by any deep cultural inheritance. But the maritime capacity that made expansion possible was built on a foundation that was genuinely ancient, genuinely rooted in the specific geographic position and specific cultural history of the island. The British Empire transformed the world, and the world transformed Britain. The feedback loops between the empire and the British population are still playing out. The immigration that brought large communities from South Asia, West Africa, the Caribbean, and East Asia to Britain in the 20th century was itself a consequence of the empire. A movement of people from former colonies to the former imperial centre that was made possible by the economic and cultural networks the empire had created. These communities added new genetic and cultural contributions to Britain that are reshaping British physical appearance in exactly the same way that earlier migrations reshaped it gradually, regionally, unevenly, producing a population that, in another 2,000 years, will be as different from the current British population as the current British population is from the Bell-Beaker people who arrived 34 centuries ago. This is not an alarming prospect. It is the normal state of affairs for a population that has always been, as we have seen, a mixture of successive arrivals rather than a fixed, static, genetically bounded group. The British population has never been one thing. It has always been a process. A continuous accumulation and modification of genetic contributions from the full range of populations that have interacted with this island over the millennia. What the British look like at any given moment is a snapshot of that process, not its final destination. And the specific quality that makes the British population interesting from a genetic and historical perspective, the preservation of ancient contributions that were lost elsewhere, the regional fragmentation that maintained genetic variation across the island's selective environment that filtered new arrivals through the specific demands of a cold and wet climate, that quality will continue to express itself on whatever populations come to call Britain home in the species future. The landscape will keep doing what it has always done. The climate will keep selecting. The channel will keep limiting, though less effectively in the age of modern transport than it did for the previous 14,000 years. And the result will be, in another 10,000 years, something that is recognizably connected to everything that came before, yet as different from the current British population as the current British population is from Cheddar Man. That long view is the appropriate frame for understanding British physical distinctiveness, not the frame of nations and histories and ethnic categories, which are real in their social effects but ephemeral in their biological reality, vanishing like writing in the sand when the timescale is measured in millennia rather than centuries. The appropriate frame is the geological one, the timescale of the island itself, The timescale over which geology and climate and ocean currents do their slow, patient, inexorable work on the living things that inhabit the surfaces they have created. On that timescale, the British are a recent phenomenon. 14,000 years of continuous human occupation sounds like a long time from inside the span of a human life, but in geological time, it is almost nothing. The Lewisian gneiss of the Scottish Highlands, which formed 3 billion years ago, has been sitting where it is for a period that makes the entire history of human occupation of Britain look like an afternoon. The chalk downs of southern England, which formed 70 million years ago from the accumulated remains of countless tiny marine organisms in a warm, shallow sea, have been eroding since then at a rate that has already consumed hundreds of meters of their original depth. The land that human populations have been living on and that has been shaping them through its climate and its resources and its selective pressures is itself part of a process that dwarfs anything human. But human populations, short-lived as they are compared to geological formations, do leave their marks on the landscape in ways that persist longer than individual lifetimes. The Neolithic clearance of the ancient forest that covered most of Britain is still visible in the landscape today. Not as forest clearance, obviously, but as the specific mosaic of field and hedge and woodland that replaced the primeval forest and that has itself been maintained, modified, and shaped by 45 centuries of subsequent agricultural management. The specific character of the British landscape today is not natural in any pristine sense. It is the accumulated product of 10,000 years of human activity, each generation's management layered on top of the previous generation's, producing something that is genuinely wild-looking in many places, but that is actually deeply artificial, a landscape that reflects, in its every contour and boundary and species distribution, the accumulated decisions of every generation of British farmers and shepherds and woodland managers who have made their living from it. And just as the landscape carries the accumulated marks of 10,000 years of human activity, the human population carries the accumulated marks of 10,000 years of interaction with that landscape. The genetics and the culture and the physical appearance are all products of that interaction, as much the product of what the island did to its inhabitants as of what its inhabitants did to each other. Britain shaped the British, not in some mystical sense, in the entirely concrete, a material sense, that the specific character of the island's climate and geology and resources, selected for specific traits and transmitted specific cognitive styles and preserved specific genetic contributions and fragmented populations into regionally distinctive groups that maintained their distinctiveness through centuries of semi-isolation. The British face is Britain, written in biology. The pale skin is the filtered light. The varied hair colours are the overlapping populations. The regional variation is the terrain. The blue eyes that show up at higher than continental average frequency are the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry, preserved in geographic corners that the diluting migrations did not fully reach. All of it is geography. All of it is time. All of it is the specific accident of an island at the edge of the world, sitting at exactly the right latitude, with exactly the right channel between it and the continent, to preserve in its people something that the rest of Europe has been busy mixing away for 10,000 years. The next time you see a face that makes you think, without quite knowing why, that you are looking at a British person, the next time you experience that indefinable quality that makes a crowd in London feel visually distinct from a crowd in Paris, you will know what you are really seeing. You are seeing 10,000 years of island history. You are seeing the sediment of multiple population replacements, each of which added its own contribution to the genetic mixture. You are seeing the product of a climate that selected relentlessly for specific physical traits across all those generations. You are seeing the regional variation that terrain-enforced isolation produced and maintained. You are seeing, in other words, not a national identity but a geological process, a living process, still ongoing, that will continue for as long as there are people living on this cold, wet, beautiful, fog-wrapped island at the edge of the Atlantic world. That is why the British look different. That is the real reason. And it is, in the end, less about history as people usually understand history with its named events and its named people and its battles and its conquests, and more about the kind of history that the landscape itself keeps, patient and precise and indifferent to the human dramas that play out on its surface, simply doing what geography does to biology over long enough periods of time. The island made the people, not completely, not deterministically, not in a way that anyone could have predicted from the geology alone, but genuinely, substantially, in ways that are written into the faces and the genes and the cognitive styles and the cultural traditions of the people who live there today, and that will continue to be written, in modified forms, into the faces of the people who will live there long after everyone alive today is gone. That is the story, and it is still being written. We have spent a great deal of time with the genetics and the geology and the climate. We have traced the successive populations that built up the British genome layer by layer. We have talked about selection pressures and island isolation and the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that Britain preserved when the rest of Europe diluted it away. All of that is essential to the story. But there is another dimension to British distinctiveness that we have not yet properly addressed, and it is perhaps the most surprising of all. It is the dimension of language. Because the way British people speak, the specific sounds they make, the specific rhythms of English as it developed on this island, the extraordinary diversity of regional accents and dialects that Britain contains within a relatively small geographic area is itself evidence of the same fundamental processes that produced the visual distinctiveness we have been exploring. And the story of the English language on the British Isles is one of the strangest linguistic stories in the world. Start with the basic facts. English is a Germanic language. It is descended from the dialects of the Anglo-Saxon settlers who arrived in Britain from the 5th century onward. Its basic grammar, its core vocabulary, the fundamental structure of its sentences, all of these trace back to the Low German dialects that the Angles and Saxons and Jutes brought with them when they crossed the North Sea. In this sense, English is similar to Dutch and Frisian, its closest continental relatives. You can still see the similarity if you look at the oldest surviving texts in all three languages. The kinship is unmistakable. But English is also, in a profound sense, not what you would expect a Germanic language to look like after 15 centuries. It has shed almost all of its grammatical gender. It has lost most of its case endings. It has borrowed vocabulary from an astonishing range of sources: Latin, Old Norse, Norman French, and then from the languages of every culture the British Empire encountered to an extent that has no parallel in any other major European language. Modern English has a vocabulary that is estimated at somewhere between 250,000 bits and a million words, depending on how you count. Far larger than any comparable European language, and still growing rapidly. And the phonology of English, the sounds it uses and the way it uses them, diverged from the continental Germanic languages in ways that are still not entirely explained by standard linguistic change mechanisms. One theory for some of the unusual features of English is substrate influence. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived in Britain and their language gradually displaced the Celtic languages of the native British population, the native speakers who were shifting to the new language carried some of the phonological and syntactic habits of their original language into their new one. This linguistic substrate effect is well documented in other contact situations and would predict that English, having emerged in a context where large numbers of Celtic speakers were shifting to a Germanic language, should show evidence of Celtic influence. And it does show some such evidence, though linguists debate how substantial the Celtic influence was and which specific features of English are attributable to it. The most dramatic influence came from the Norman conquest. In 1066, a French-speaking ruling class was imposed on an English-speaking majority, and the result was centuries of bilingualism in the upper social strata of English society, with French being the language of the court and law and literature, and English being the language of the majority population. When the two finally merged, in a process that took roughly 3 centuries, the result was a language that had absorbed enormous quantities of Latin-derived vocabulary through French while maintaining the Germanic skeleton of its grammar. This is why English has so many near-synonymous pairs of words, where one comes from Germanic roots and one from French or Latin: ask and inquire, buy and purchase, end and terminate, eat and consume. The Germanic word is usually the more everyday, more colloquial one. The French or Latin word is usually more formal, more educated, more associated with the institutions that the Norman ruling class controlled. This specific linguistic history produced something unusual, a language that can reach different registers of formality by switching between its Germanic substrate and its French-Latin overlay, giving English a flexibility of tone and register that other European languages achieve through different mechanisms. The writer who wants to sound educated and formal reaches for the Latinate vocabulary. The writer who wants to sound immediate and earthy reaches for the Germanic. And the writer who understands how English works uses both, playing them against each other to create effects that are available in English in ways they are not available in languages with more unified vocabulary histories. But the most striking feature of the English language on the British Isles is not its vocabulary or its grammar. It is its accents. Britain has, per square kilometre, more accent diversity than any other English-speaking region in the world. An American might move 1,000 kilometres across the country and encounter accents that are recognisably similar. A British person can move 20 kilometres and encounter an accent that is noticeably different in ways that other speakers immediately associate with a specific place. Yorkshire and Lancashire, separated by the Pennine Hills, have distinct accents that have been distinct for centuries. Geordie, the accent of the Newcastle region, is so different from Southern English that it is frequently incomprehensible to speakers from southern England without some experience. The difference between a Glaswegian accent and an Edinburgh accent within the same city region in Scotland is immediately perceptible to any Scottish speaker. The accents of Cornwall and Devon are distinct from each other, and from the West Country accents of Somerset and Dorset, which are themselves distinct from the accents of Bristol, which is distinct from Birmingham, which is distinct from every other major English city. This diversity is not random. It maps, with remarkable precision, onto the historical geography of Britain, that we have been describing the semi-isolated regional communities, each preserving its own linguistic variation as they preserved their own genetic variation, each developing over centuries into something recognizably distinct because the terrain and the social structure limited the amount of inter-regional movement that would otherwise have ironed out the differences. The accents of Britain are a linguistic record of the same regional fragmentation that the genetics record. They are the sound of island isolation expressing itself through language rather than through faces and genomes. And the foreign observer's experience of British accents is, in a curious way, parallel to the foreign observer's experience of British faces. Both produce a sense of unusual, unexpected diversity in a small geographic area. A visitor to Britain from, say, Japan or Brazil, encountering British people from different regions, will notice that both the faces and the voices seem to vary more than expected, given the small size of the country. This is not an illusion. Both the genetic and the linguistic variation are real, and both reflect the same fundamental processes: geographic fragmentation, historical semi-isolation, the specific character of an island whose terrain prevented the full mixing and homogenization that produces the more uniform populations and more uniform accents of larger, flatter continental regions. The Celtic languages themselves deserve attention here. Welsh is still spoken by over 500,000 people in Wales as a first language, and by a much larger number as a second language. Scottish Gaelic survives in parts of the Highlands and Islands. Irish Gaelic, though not technically a British language, is the ancestral language of a significant part of the population of the British Isles. These languages are survivors, the descendants of the language family that dominated Britain before the Anglo-Saxon arrival, maintained through centuries of political pressure that repeatedly attempted to extinguish them and that succeeded in extinguishing Cornish and Cumbrian and several other Celtic languages that once contributed to the linguistic mosaic of the island. The survival of Welsh and Scottish Gaelic is a testament to the same forces of geographic isolation and community resilience that preserved the genetic distinctiveness of the populations that speak them. The Welsh mountains that sheltered Welsh genetic distinctiveness from Anglo-Saxon admixture also sheltered the Welsh language from Anglo-Saxon linguistic replacement. And there is something particularly remarkable about Welsh, which is the oldest literary language in continuous use in Europe after Greek and Latin. Welsh poetry goes back to the 6th century AD, to a tradition of professional court poetry that was already ancient by the standards of the early medieval period. The Welsh poetic tradition preserves linguistic forms and compositional techniques that are, in some respects, the oldest living examples of indigenous British cultural production. The language that those poems were written in is the direct descendant of the Brittonic Celtic language that was spoken across most of Britain before the Anglo-Saxon arrival. When you hear Welsh spoken or sung, you are hearing something that connects directly to the language of the people who lived alongside the Roman legions, who inhabited the hill forts of the Iron Age, who may have spoken the language of the people who, 1,000 years earlier, maintained and used the ancient megalithic monuments of the island. That is not nothing. That is a thread of linguistic continuity, running from the present back to a world so ancient that the Bronze Age population replacement, the most dramatic genetic event in British prehistory, falls within its span. Welsh is older than the Bell Beaker people's arrival. It is the descendant of a language that was already present when those Bronze Age migrants came flooding in from the continent and replaced the genetic majority of the island's population. The genes were replaced, but something linguistic, something cultural, survived, transformed, modified, adopted and adapted by successive generations, but surviving from a time that predates everything in the conventional history of Britain that begins with the Celts and the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. This linguistic survival mirrors what we have seen in the genetics. The populations that preserved the oldest genetic contributions also preserved the oldest linguistic tradition. The western and northern regions of Britain, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, that received the least admixture from the post-Roman Eastern migrations are also the regions where Celtic languages survived longest and in some cases still survive today. The genetic history and the linguistic history track each other with the same precision that the genetic history tracks the geological geography. They are all the same story, the story of what islands do to the things that live on them. They preserve the old, filter the new, and produce, over time, something that is genuinely and measurably distinct from the continental average. There is one more dimension of British distinctiveness that deserves careful consideration before we bring this exploration to its close. And it is perhaps the most personally resonant of all the dimensions we have examined. It is the dimension of experience of what it actually feels like, from the inside, to be shaped by this island and its history and its climate and its particular quality of light and weather. There is a concept in Welsh that has no precise English equivalent, although the English language has borrowed many concepts from Welsh over the centuries. The word is hyreth. It is usually translated as longing or nostalgia or a deep yearning for home, but those translations are inadequate. Hyreth is specifically the feeling of longing for something that may not exist, or may no longer exist, or may never have existed in the form in which it is longed for. It is nostalgia for a home you cannot return to, not because you are absent from it, but because the home you remember exists only in memory, and memory is not the same thing as the place. It is longing for a past that was itself imperfect, but that in retrospect takes on a luminosity that the present cannot match. It is, at its deepest, a form of grief for the gap between the world as it is and the world as you feel it ought to be, or once was, or might have been. This concept exists in Welsh. It was named in Welsh. It belongs to the oldest surviving linguistic tradition in Britain, and it resonates with something that many people, not just Welsh people, not just British people, recognize as a genuine feature of human experience in this part of the world. The specific quality of longing for something ancient and lost, for a relationship with the landscape that feels more intimate than the present can offer, for a connection to something deep and old that the modern world seems to have obscured, is a feeling that has a specific geography. It is more intense at the Atlantic margins of Europe. It is more intense in the places where the landscape is oldest and most continuous with its deep human past. It is more intense in the places where the genetic memory of the oldest populations has been best preserved. This is not mysticism. It is not an appeal to racial memory or any of the other illegitimate concepts that have historically been used to invest a particular people's relationship to a particular landscape with claims of superiority or ownership. It is simply an observation about what long human habitation of a place does to the relationship between the people and the place, how it builds up, across generations, a specific cultural texture, a specific quality of attachment, a specific kind of meaning that the landscape carries for the community that has been living in it for so long that the landscape and the community have genuinely shaped each other in ways that cannot be untangled. The British landscape is, in a very real sense, a human creation, not the geology, not the climate, but the specific mosaic of field and hedge and woodland and pasture and village and town that covers the lowlands of Britain has been built and maintained by human hands for 45 centuries of continuous agricultural management. The ancient trees that mark old woodland boundaries carry, in their age and placement, records of medieval farming systems. The hedgerows that divide fields in Devon and Cornwall are, in some cases, 2,000 years old, maintained continuously since the Iron Age, each generation cutting and laying and managing them in ways that were learned from the previous generation. The specific plants that grow in those hedgerows reflect 2,000 years of management history. Species that are common in old hedgerows because the management practices favoured them, species that are rare because the management practices didn't. This reciprocal shaping people, shaping landscape, landscape shaping people, back and forth across 45 centuries of agricultural management is the deepest form of the distinctiveness we have been exploring. Deeper than the genetics, which themselves reflect this process. Deeper than the linguistics, which also reflect it. Deeper than the specific physical characteristics that make a British face recognizable. All of those things are expressions, in different media, of the same fundamental phenomenon. A very long, very particular relationship between a human population and a specific piece of the Earth's surface, conducted across enough generations that the relationship has become genuinely constitutive of both parties. The landscape is partly British because the British made it. The British are partly the landscape because it made them. That mutual constitution, that long, reciprocal shaping, is what makes Britain, in the end, genuinely distinct. Not genetically superior, not culturally superior, not in any sense that could be used to rank it above or below any other people or any other place. Simply distinct, different, in specific, traceable, historically grounded ways from any other place and any other people. The product of a specific long history that happened in a specific place and could not have happened in exactly the same way anywhere else. Every place, every people, has this specificity, if you look closely enough. Every population is the product of a specific geographic and climatic and historical context that made it what it is, and that is not perfectly replicated anywhere else on Earth. Britain's case is not unique in being specific. It is notable for the particular quality of its specificity, for the ways in which the island's geography preserved ancient genetic contributions that were lost elsewhere, for the dramatic succession of population events that wrote themselves into the genetics and the culture with unusual legibility, for the specific climatic character that produced both the visual distinctiveness we perceive and the cognitive style that shaped British intellectual and cultural life. All of which brings us back to where we started, standing in a crowd in central London, feeling something you cannot quite articulate, a subtle but persistent sense of visual difference from the continental European crowd you stood in yesterday. That feeling is real. It corresponds to a real genomic reality and a real historical reality. And the history behind it is stranger, older, more complicated, and more beautiful than anything the simple phrase, "British people look different," could possibly suggest. The British look different because they are the end product of 10,000 years of island history, because the first humans to cross Doggerland carried genetic characteristics that were preserved in unusual concentration by the island's geography, because the Bell Beaker people who replaced years of island climate selection, because the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings added their contributions to the east and north without fully replacing what came before, because the terrain fragmented populations into regional enclaves that maintained their specific mixtures for centuries longer than continental geography would have allowed, because the climate selected relentlessly for certain physical traits and certain cognitive styles and certain cultural orientations, because the sea preserved the ancient while allowing selective connection to the new, because geography, in the end, always shapes biology, and the specific geography of this specific island shaped its human inhabitants in ways that are visible today in the faces of the people who live on it. The island made the British what they are. The island is still making them, and the faces of the people who walk the streets of its cities and its villages and its moorlands and its coastlines carry, in their bone structure and their colouring and the specific range of their variation, the entire long story of that, making a story that is still being written, still being added to by new arrivals and new genetic contributions and new selective pressures, and that will look different again in another 1,000 years when whatever comes after the current moment of British history has had time to express itself in the biology of the people who live here. But for now, standing in this moment, the faces are what they are, the product of everything that came before, carrying in their genetics the accumulated residue of 14,000 years of human occupation of a cold island at the edge of the world, still showing, in those who look for it, the faint traces of the oldest populations that ever made this place their home, still carrying in their regional variation the echo of every migration and every period of isolation that the island's history contains, still being shaped, day by day, by the specific quality of light and weather and landscape that defines the experience of living here. That is the real reason. Not a simple one, not a clean one, not a reason that fits on a plaque or in a textbook, but the true one, reaching all the way back to the ice and the first people and the rising seas that cut the island off from the continent and set it on its long, strange, specific path to producing the faces we see here today. The question was why? The answer is everything. The island, the time, the people, the weather, the sea, the ancient populations whose traces survive in genes and faces, and perhaps in something more elusive, still in the specific quality of attention that this landscape has always demanded and that its people have always, generation by generation, provided. That attentiveness is the oldest British inheritance of all. And it is still alive, in the faces, looking out at the world from an island that was making its people distinct long before there was a word for any of it. The story goes all the way down, all the way back, all the way to the beginning of the human presence on this island, and perhaps even further, to the landscape itself and what it was doing long before any human arrived to be shaped by it. 10,000 years of making, and it is still not finished. The British face is still being written. The island is still at work. And, in the specific, unrepeatable, endlessly surprising result of that work, in the faces that turn toward you on any street in any British city, you can see, if you look carefully, if you know what you are looking at, the entire long history of a small, cold, fog-wrapped island at the edge of the world, doing what islands do, preserving the old, filtering the new, making something that exists nowhere else, making, across the millennia, the British. There is one more thing we need to talk about, and it is the thing that ties all of the threads together in a way that no amount of genetics or geology or linguistic history quite captures on its own. It is the question of what happens when a population that has been shaped by a specific island for 10,000 years suddenly encounters the rest of the world, not as visitors, not as traders or travelers, but as a dominant force that for several centuries effectively imposed itself on every other population it encountered. What does that encounter do to the British? And what does it do to the concept of British distinctiveness itself? The British Empire was, above all else, a project of encounter. A project of British people meeting populations whose physical appearance, cultural traditions, genetic histories, and relationships to landscape were as different from British experience as it is possible to be within the single species that all of humanity shares. And the British response to that encounter the specific ways in which British people understood, categorized, managed, exploited, and occasionally learned from the populations they encountered was itself shaped by everything we have been discussing. By the specific cognitive style that the island had produced, by the specific relationship to observation and classification and empirical detail that the British intellectual tradition had developed, by the specific combination of cultural confidence and genuine curiosity that characterized the best of British engagement with the wider world, and by the specific assumptions, some of which were deeply wrong and deeply harmful, that the imperial project built on top of those genuine cognitive tendencies. The British were, in the context of their empire, acutely aware of physical difference, of the variation in appearance between the populations they encountered and themselves. They classified it, categorized it, built elaborate pseudo-scientific systems to explain it, and used those systems to justify exploitation. This is one of the darkest chapters in the story of what British distinctiveness has meant in practice, and it cannot be omitted from any honest account of the phenomenon we are investigating. Because the same island-shaped cognitive tendency toward observation and classification that produced the best of British science was also capable of producing the worst of British racial taxonomy. The same empiricist impulse that drove Robert Boyle to measure and record and refuse to accept inherited authority also drove the Victorian anthropologists who measured skulls and recorded skin tones and built hierarchical classification, systems that placed British physical characteristics at the top of an imaginary scale of human value. We now know those systems were wrong. Not just morally wrong, though they were that. Factually, empirically, scientifically wrong. The genetics that have given us everything we have been discussing in this exploration have also thoroughly demolished the idea that human populations can be ranked in terms of biological value or capability. The genetic differences between human populations are real. We have been describing them in great detail, but they are differences of history and geography and adaptation to specific environments, not differences of fundamental capability or worth. The populations that the British Empire encountered and often exploited carried genetic heritages as ancient, as complex, as shaped by specific long histories of interaction between people and place, as the British heritage we have been describing. Those heritages were different. They were not lesser. The British Empire's encounter with human diversity was not purely destructive. It created genuine bodies of knowledge about the natural world, about human cultures and languages and practices that have real scientific value even when they were gathered in morally compromised circumstances. The natural history collections, the linguistic surveys, the archaeological excavations, the botanical and zoological classifications that empire made possible have contributed to human knowledge in ways that are separable from the imperial context in which they were conducted, even if they cannot be fully separated from the power relations that made them possible in the first place. The Natural History Museum in London, the British Museum, the archives of the Royal Geographical Society. These institutions contain knowledge about the world that is genuinely valuable and that was gathered, in significant part, by British people who were genuinely curious about the world they were encountering, even when that curiosity was embedded in a political project that was causing enormous harm. But the Empire's legacy for the question of British distinctiveness is most immediate in what it did to Britain itself. Because the Empire brought the world to Britain in ways that were not only genetic, as we discussed earlier, but cultural and culinary and linguistic and artistic in ways that have permanently transformed the experience of being British. The curry house, that quintessentially British institution that does not quite exist anywhere else in the world, a form of South Asian restaurant cuisine that was adapted to British tastes over generations of interaction between South Asian chefs and British customers, is a perfect emblem of this transformation. It is not authentically Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi cuisine. It is something that emerged from the specific encounter between South Asian culinary traditions and British tastes and British ingredients and British economic conditions. It is a hybrid that belongs to Britain in a way it belongs nowhere else, and it is now considered, by many British people, to be one of the defining elements of British food culture, more authentically British, in some surveys, than fish and chips. This hybridization is happening at every level simultaneously. The British English that is spoken in the 21st century contains vocabulary from South Asian languages, from Caribbean Creoles, from West African languages, from the entire range of languages that empire and immigration have brought into contact with British English over the past several centuries. The music that is considered most distinctively British, the pop and rock tradition that gave the world the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and a long sequence of subsequent innovations, was itself built on a foundation of African-American musical traditions imported to Britain through recordings, and cultural exchange, and the specific encounter that the post-war period of American military presence in Britain made possible. Everything that has been called distinctively British has itself been made from the encounter with everything that was not British, and has been transformed by that encounter in ways that make the very concept of an original, pure, unencountered British distinctiveness a fiction. And yet the fiction keeps being perceived. The visitor to Britain keeps noticing that something is different here. The geneticist keeps finding that the British population is measurably distinct from its closest continental neighbours. The linguist keeps noting that British accents are unusually diverse for a small geographic area. The historian keeps recognizing that the British intellectual tradition has a specific character that has persisted through enormous cultural change. These perceptions are not wrong. The distinctiveness is real. It is just that the distinctiveness is itself the product of encounter and transformation and hybridization, going all the way back to the beginning to the Bell-Beaker people who replaced the megalith builders and adopted their monuments, to the Anglo-Saxons who absorbed the Celtic population while being absorbed by its language into something neither fully Germanic nor fully Celtic, to the Normans who brought French vocabulary and were eventually absorbed into Englishness. British distinctiveness has always been the product of mixing. It has never been the product of purity. The purity was always a story told about something that was, in biological and cultural reality, a process of continuous combination and transformation. The specific result of that process, at any given moment, is genuinely distinct. But the distinctiveness is a snapshot of a moving target, not the fixed nature of a settled people. Britain in 2024 is distinct from France and Germany in specific, measurable ways. Britain in 2124 will be distinct from those countries in different ways. The process will have continued. New contributions will have been added. The island's selective environment will have done some more of its work. The terrain will have continued fragmenting populations into semi-isolated communities with their own specific mixtures. And the result will be recognizably British in the sense that it will have emerged from this specific island with its specific history, but it will look different from the Britain of today in ways that would probably surprise people from the current era if they could see it. This is the correct way to understand British distinctiveness, not as a fixed characteristic of a bounded population, but as a description of a process, the process of what this island does to human populations across time. That process has distinctive features that are consistent across thousands of years of operation. The preservation of ancient genetic contributions through geographic isolation, the regional fragmentation of populations by terrain, the selection of specific physical traits by climate, the specific cognitive style reinforced by the specific demands of the landscape, the maritime orientation enforced by the island's surrounded position. All of these features of the process are consistent. The specific output of the process changes with each generation as new inputs arrive and as the accumulated history of previous outputs continues to be modified by ongoing interaction. Understanding that is understanding what Britain actually is, not a nation in the simple sense of a fixed people with a fixed territory and a fixed cultural tradition, but something more dynamic and more ancient and more interesting than that, a place that has been doing something specific to human populations for 14,000 years, and that shows no signs of stopping. A place with its own logic, its own demands, its own selective pressures, its own ways of shaping the people who come to inhabit it into something that did not quite exist before, and that carries the marks of the place itself in ways that are detectable, in different registers, in the genetics and the languages and the faces and the cultural styles of the people who call it home. That is the full story, or as much of it as can be told in the time available and with the evidence currently in hand. New ancient DNA samples will change some of the specifics. New archaeological discoveries will revise some of the timelines. New genomic studies will refine the picture of which populations contributed what to the modern British genetic mixture. The story is not finished. The science is not finished. Britain is not finished. But the broad outlines are clear enough. And they tell a story that is, in every way that matters, the opposite of simple. Not a story of a single people with a single origin and a single defining characteristic. A story of layers and time and the specific character of a place that shaped its inhabitants in specific ways over a very long period of time. A story of preservation and transformation, of ancient things surviving and new things arriving, and the two constantly interacting to produce something that is genuinely neither the old nor the new, but always something specific to this island and this moment. The British look different because of all of that, because of the Ice Age and the Channel and the climate and the genetics and the history and the landscape and the 10,000 years of mutual shaping between a cold island and the people who lived on it. Because of Doggerland and Cheddarman and the Bell-Beaker people and the Anglo-Saxons and every subsequent arrival that has added its contribution to the mixture. Because of the specific light that filters through British clouds and the specific cold that British winters deliver, and the specific way that British terrain has always fragmented its populations into regional communities that maintained their distinctiveness longer than continental geography would have allowed. All of that is written in the faces. In the specific, unrepeatable combination of ancient and recent, of preserved and modified, of selected and accumulated that British faces represent when you look at them carefully enough to see past the individual to the deep history that every individual carries without knowing it. Now, before we come to the very end of this particular journey, there is one final aspect of British physical distinctiveness that deserves attention, one that has been present as an undercurrent throughout everything we have discussed, but that we have not yet addressed directly. It is the question of the uncanny, of why British faces, in certain lights and certain configurations, can seem to suggest something that is difficult to place, something older than the historical categories we have for understanding them, something that sits just outside the range of what any continental European face typically expresses. This is a subjective impression. It is not something that can be measured in a genomic study or quantified in a physical anthropology survey. But it is an impression that enough people have had, in enough different contexts, that it deserves to be taken seriously as a cultural observation, even if it cannot be given a precise biological foundation. There is something in certain British faces, most often in the faces of people from the western and northern regions, the Celtic margins, the places where ancient genetic contributions have been best preserved, that seems to look back at you from a distance that is not merely spatial. That seems to carry in its expression something that does not quite fit the contemporary moment, something that belongs to a longer time frame than any individual life. This is probably what people are perceiving when they experience British landscapes as haunted, as carrying in their contours a presence that does not feel entirely reducible to their physical features. The feeling that a particular hill fort in Wales, or a particular arrangement of standing stones in Orkney, or a particular curve of moorland in Devon, carries in it the accumulated experience of every human who has ever stood in that place, not as a supernatural presence, but as a quality of the place itself that has been shaped by that accumulation, that carries in its texture and its atmosphere the residue of 10,000 years of human presence. And when you see that same quality in a face, when you look at a face that seems to carry in it the accumulated residue of all the generations that preceded this particular individual, you are seeing something real. You are seeing the phenotypic expression of a genetic history that is genuinely ancient, in a way that most contemporary genetic histories are not. This is, ultimately, what Chetterman's ghost looks like in the modern world. Not a literal resemblance, the genes have been mixed and diluted and combined with too many subsequent contributions for any simple resemblance to persist. But a quality of depth, a sense of something looking out of contemporary eyes that has been looking out of eyes in this landscape for longer than any named history describes. The ancient Atlantic coast people who built the megalithic monuments did not simply disappear. They were genetically absorbed into the Bell Beaker population and all the subsequent populations that followed. They contribute, at some percentage, to the genetic mixture of every person in Britain today, more in some regions, less in others, but never zero, never entirely absent. And their contribution, which we can now measure in percentage terms in a genome analysis, also contributes something to appearance, something to the specific character of the faces it enters, something that has no name in the vocabulary of contemporary genetics, but that is real nonetheless. The British look different because they carry, in their faces and their genes and their cultural traditions and their cognitive styles, the entire long history of an island that has been shaping its human inhabitants since before history began. That history is deep, it is complex, it is full of catastrophic replacements and partial survivals, and the specific accidents of geography and time that make every population's story unique. And it has produced, in the people who live on this island today, something that is genuinely, measurably, specifically distinct from any other population on Earth. That distinctiveness is not a claim of superiority. It is not a defense of any kind of exclusivity or purity or special status. It is simply a fact about what happens when a specific place shapes specific people over a very long period of time. The British look different because Britain made them that way. And Britain made them that way because that is what Britain does, what every island does, every landscape does. Every specific combination of climate and geology and resource and selective pressure does to the human populations that make their lives within it. Understanding that is understanding something important about all human populations, not just the British. Every face on Earth carries a version of this story. A story of specific ancestry and specific geography and specific history and specific selection and specific accident. The British story is remarkable for its specificity, for the specific ways in which island geography preserved the ancient and fragmented the diverse, and selected the particular combination of physical characteristics that we recognize as distinctively British. But the principle is universal. Every population is the product of its place and its time. Every face carries, in its specific configuration, the accumulated residue of everything that happened to the people who came before. The British face is a window into deep time, a record of events that happened before writing and before civilization and before any of the categories that we normally use to understand human difference existed. It is the face of the Ice Age, and the early Holocene and the Bronze Age Revolution and the Iron Age and the Roman period and all the centuries since, layered on top of each other in a mixture that is neither any of its components nor all of them, but something specific that emerged from their particular combination in a particular place. That is why they look different. That is the answer to the question we started with. And it is, in the end, not really a question about the British at all. It is a question about what time does to people, about what place does to people, about what the long, slow, patient work of natural history does to the creatures that live within it, shaping them, generation by generation, into forms that reflect the specific character of the place and the time that made them. The British happen to be a particularly legible example. Their island geography made the story easier to trace than it is in most continental populations, where the mixing and movement of populations across open terrain has blurred the boundaries between ancestral contributions in ways that make the individual threads harder to identify. In Britain, the threads are somewhat more separate, somewhat more preserved in their regional distributions, somewhat more traceable back to their origins in the specific history of this specific island. That legibility is itself part of what makes Britain fascinating to geneticists and archaeologists and historians. The island is an unusually well-preserved laboratory for the study of what population history does to human appearance and culture and cognitive style. And the results of that study confirm something that is, in retrospect, not at all surprising. When you put a human population on an island, cut it off from the full force of continental migration, expose it to a specific climate for 10,000 years, and allow it to fragment into semi-isolated regional communities that maintain their specific genetic mixtures across centuries, what you get is something specific, something distinct, something that looks, to the observer who encounters it, subtly but persistently different from what you find anywhere else. Something, in a word, British. And as you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, you carry in your own body a story as old and as specific as this one, whatever corner of the world you come from. Your face, your genetics, your physical characteristics, all of them are the product of the same kind of process we have been describing, the specific place your ancestors came from, the specific climate and landscape and selective pressures they lived within, the specific migrations and replacements and partial survivals that shaped their genetic history. All of it is written in you, as it is written in the British faces we have been exploring. You are a product of your deep past in the same way that they are. You carry, in your body and your genes and your cultural instincts, the accumulated residue of everything that happened to the people who came before you in the specific place from which you emerged. That place shaped you. That time shaped you. That long chain of ancestry and selection and accident and survival shaped you into the specific, unrepeatable individual you are today. All of us, everywhere, are the products of this process. All of our faces carry the story of where we came from and what that place did to the people who lived there over centuries and millennia of continuous habitation. The British story is one version of that universal human story. A particularly interesting version, shaped by the specific accident of island geography and a particular chain of historical events. But not a different kind of story. The same story that every face on Earth tells, if you know how to read it. The ice retreats, the seas rise, the island is cut off, the people on it begin the long process of becoming what their place demands. Generation by generation, the shaping continues. And it is still going on, right now, on a cold island at the edge of the Atlantic world, producing faces that carry the marks of everything that happened there, all the way back to the beginning. Rest now. The old stories don't need you to stay awake for them. They have been telling themselves since before anyone was there to listen, and they will keep telling themselves long after tonight is over, in every face that looks out at the world from that cold, beautiful, fog-wrapped island, carrying in its specific features the entire long history of the place that made it. Sleep and dream, if you can, of ice and open water and the first crossing. Of the ancient people who stood at the edge of the land and looked out at the rising sea and understood, in whatever way understanding came to them, that they were being made into something new by the specific place they had come to call home. They were. And so, in your own way, wherever you are you. There is a small detail about the British Isles that most histories gloss over, and it is one that matters more than its apparent insignificance suggests. The islands, and there are more than 6,000 of them, if you count every piece of land that sticks above water at high tide off the coasts of Britain and Ireland, have always functioned as more than a single landmass. They have functioned as an archipelago, a cluster of related but distinct environments, each with its own microclimate, its own resources, its own ecological character, and its own history of human occupation. And the people who lived on the smaller islands, the Orkney archipelago, the Shetland Islands, the Hebrides, the islands off the Welsh coast, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man developed, through centuries of additional isolation imposed by the sea that surrounded them, some of the most distinctive physical and cultural profiles in the entire British Isles. Orkney, specifically, deserves attention here. The Orkney archipelago sits at the very northeastern edge of the British Isles, where the North Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean in a stretch of water so turbulent that it has sunk ships for as long as there have been ships to sink. These islands are closer to Bergen in Norway than they are to London. They were settled by Neolithic farmers 5,000 years ago, and those settlers built on Orkney some of the most remarkable monuments in the entire British megalithic tradition: the Ring of Brodgar, Skara Brae, Mace Howe, structures that predate Stonehenge, and that, in the case of Mace Howe's astronomical alignment to the midwinter sunset, demonstrate a precision of celestial observation that rivals anything the megalith builders produced anywhere else in the British Isles. The Orcadians of today carry in their genetics the legacy of that long, specific island history, a history that includes the Neolithic farmers who built the monuments, the Bell Beaker people who followed them, and then an extraordinarily heavy Norse contribution from the Viking settlement of the 9th and 10th centuries that left Orkney genetically closer to Norway than to southern England in certain analyses. And the faces of the Orcadians reflect that specific layering, a specific combination of ancient Atlantic coast ancestry and heavy Scandinavian contribution that produces a physical profile that is recognizably distinct even within the diversity of the British Isles. The Channel Islands, at the opposite southern extreme, tell a different story. Closer to France than to England, the island of Jersey is only 15 kilometers from the Normandy coast. They have been inhabited since at least the Neolithic period, and have experienced a history of cultural and genetic verses, exchange with both the French mainland and with Britain, that has produced a population with its own specific character. The Channel Island Norman-French dialect that was spoken on Jersey and Guernsey for centuries, Jerriese and Guernesey, represents a linguistic survival as remarkable in its own way as Welsh, the descendant of the medieval Norman French of William the Conqueror's era, preserved in an island environment that slowed its extinction. These tiny islands at the intersection of English and French cultural spheres have been, for their entire history, a place where the mixing that the larger islands manage to avoid or slow down happens more freely, producing a genetic and cultural profile that sits between the two larger traditions without being fully either. All of these island stories are the same story at different scales. The same process of geographic isolation and selective preservation and specific encounter between place and population that we have been describing for Britain as a whole, operating at a finer resolution, producing more extreme outcomes because smaller islands impose stronger isolation than larger ones and therefore preserve genetic and cultural distinctiveness more completely. The islands within the islands are, in a sense, the most extreme expression of the fundamental British dynamic, the island dynamic, the process by which surrounding water slows the mixing that continental geography allows freely and preserves, in the populations that live within its limits, the accumulated history of who was there and what the place demanded of them. The history of these smaller islands is also, often, the history of extraordinary human resilience in the face of geographic conditions that made survival genuinely difficult. The people of Street, Kilda, the remote Atlantic island group, 50 kilometers west of the Outer Hebrides, maintained a continuous human community for at least 2,000 years, in conditions that would defeat most modern expeditions. They evolved a specific set of physical characteristics, including unusually developed leg muscles for navigating the steep and treacherous cliffs from which they collected seabirds, and a specific relationship to the ocean and the weather that represented the accumulated adaptive wisdom of dozens of generations of living in one of the most exposed, inhabited places in the Atlantic world. Street. Kilda was evacuated in 1930, its last inhabitants choosing to leave when the population had shrunk too small to be self-sustaining. But the people descended from the evacuees carry in their genetics the specific signature of Street. Kildan isolation, a genetic bottleneck that is detectable in their genomes and that reflects the centuries of near-total genetic isolation that the island's remoteness imposed. These extreme cases are important not because they are representative of the broader British population, which they are not, but because they illustrate in concentrated form the mechanisms that operate, at lower intensity, across the British Isles as a whole. The island dynamic, operating at the scale of the Outer Hebrides or Street, Kilda or Orkney, produces more extreme outcomes, more genetic distinctiveness, more physical specificity, more concentrated cultural preservation because the isolation is more complete. The same dynamic, operating at the scale of Britain as a whole relative to continental Europe, produces milder versions of the same effects. The English Channel is not as complete a barrier as the 50 kilometers of North Atlantic between Street, Kilda and the nearest inhabited island, but it is a barrier. And barriers, at whatever scale they operate, do the same thing. They slow the mixing, preserve the old, and allow specific location.